Welcome to the enchanting world of Bella Brown's historical Western romance. I'm delighted to share this journey with you today. Before we ride into the story, if you enjoy these narrations, please consider subscribing to this channel. It's a small gesture that makes a big difference, and your support makes it possible to continue bringing these heartfelt tales to listeners everywhere, completely free of charge. Now find yourself a comfortable spot, close your eyes if you wish, and allow your imagination to travel back to the American frontier, where adventure and romance await. This audiobook presentation features The Bride's New Horizon by Bella Brown. All rights reserved. Chapter 1. Margaret stood at the window in her room, gazing out over the city of Boston. It was a familiar view she'd known her whole life. She knew she should take comfort in seeing the same house across the street where her best childhood friend used to live, and she ought to be quite pleased to see that new structures were going up a few blocks over, ensuring the boom of the city had not yet reached its peak. The general din of the household around her should be the lullaby of her life. All of that, logically, should be true. At one point, it certainly was. Now, though, it only reminded her of how much her life had changed over the last few months. She pressed her lips together as she gripped the windowsill and watched the midwinter snow drifting down onto rooftops, coating the lawns along the street as a white blanket, settling in a little dome on the top of the fence posts at the Bennett place. She needed an answer. No, what she needed was a solution. Margaret Bennett had never been one to sit and stew, nor was she known in these parts for someone to just let life happen to her. She was a woman who took charge. It drove her parents to distraction that their only surviving child wasn't the compliant sort. Margaret took life by the collar and dragged it along behind her, bending it to her will. It was the source of much gossip at the fancy balls she attended. Maybe the other guests didn't realize that she'd heard what they whispered to each other about her behind their hands. That was just fine with her, of course. Right now, though, no solution out of her current predicament seemed to come to mind. Every path forward she could think of slammed into a brick wall just as hard as those her father's construction company had been building all over New England. Margaret couldn't remember when she hadn't been able to think herself out of a tough situation, though her current one was tougher than she'd ever imagined. Camilla's voice followed a soft knock at her bedroom door. "Miss?" Her heart clenched, and her grip on the window frame tightened. Margaret glanced down at the street, but she saw no fresh tracks in the snow that led around to the carriage house. Her tension eased, but only some. "Yes?" The door slowly opened, and Camilla entered carrying a tray. Steam escaped from the lid of the teapot until she set the tray down on the table and readjusted it. "Your mother asked that I bring up a bit of something for you. You've been spending all day in your room, which isn't like you. I mean, that's how she explained it." For the first time that day, Margaret let out a laugh. "Oh, Camilla, don't be shy about that sort of thing. I know perfectly well that I don't usually spend all day holed up in my room. I ought to be demanding that the grooms get the sleigh out or throwing snowballs at unsuspecting passersby from behind the fence." Camilla giggled. "That is certainly more of what I'd expect. Are you feeling ill?" How could she possibly answer that? Her stomach was swirling just as much as her mind was, but it didn't have anything to do with the type of illness that Camilla meant. "You can tell my mother that I'm a bit under the weather since I think that'll please her. It's easier for her to think that than anything else." Eyeing her as she finished arranging the items on the tray, Camilla asked, "I take it you're not ill? You don't want the tea?" "The tea sounds lovely," Margaret insisted, taking a seat at the table. The little cup of steaming tea alongside the little squares of toast and the small bowl of soup truly did sound comforting. They wouldn't solve her problem, though. "It's better than standing by the cold window, at any rate. Let me build up the fire for you." Camilla was at the hearth in a flash, stirring up the coals that remained and adding more wood. "This weather is terrible." Margaret glanced out the window once more, though she could only see the gray sky from her seated position. "That depends on how you look at it. All this snow covers things up. It makes them look a bit different and gives you a fresh perspective. The maid tipped her head slightly as she stood and dusted her hands. There was a bit in the paper about how we might get even more snow. Her eyes fell to the folded paper on the side of the tray. Margaret knew her parents must be very worried about her. Mr. Bennett was usually engrossed in the paper for a good part of the day, insisting that absorbing every bit of news was the key to staying ahead and knowing what choices to make. Considering the fortune her father had amassed, she couldn't exactly say that he was wrong. I suppose that means we won't be having any visitors for a while. I could send over to the Duffy house and see if their daughter might be willing to come for tea if you're feeling lonesome, Camilla offered. No, Margaret snapped, her quickness making the maid's eyes widen. I'm sorry, I should have been clearer. I don't desire any visitors, and so I'm rather grateful for the snow right now. Oh, Camilla's mouth pursed for a moment. What about... No? Her voice was sharp as her heart tightened in her chest, and every muscle in her body tensed. Her appetite vanished, but she balled her fists, fighting to bring her body back to equilibrium. Panic would solve nothing. There would be consequences, she was sure. Hiding wasn't the solution she needed, but it was the only thing she could do to buy some time. Camilla was looking at her strangely. Margaret held the girl's gaze. If, by chance, any visitors come to see me, please tell them that I'm ill. It's not such an odd thing, this time of year and with the weather being so cold. She lifted her brows, silently imploring Camilla to understand. Whether the maid truly comprehended the gravity of the situation, or if she simply wanted to be the loyal, faithful servant that she had been for the last several years, she nodded. As you wish. Thank you. And thank you so very much for the food. I think I needed it, though I hadn't quite realized it just yet. She sat down, aware that she must act as normal as possible. She forced herself to spoon up a mouthful of soup, allowing herself to indulge in the deep flavors. Cook never just threw something together. It was always crafted with thought, purpose, and experience. It was no wonder that her parents had kept her on for so long, despite the high salary she demanded. Is the soup all right? You're frowning at it. Margaret looked up to see Camilla's concerned face. It's quite nice. Thank you so very much, Camilla. You know, you've been a wonderful maid to me. I know that I haven't always been easy to put up with, and many others in your position would have already left for a calmer household. Many of them did before you came along. Now the maid straightened, her shoulders tightening. Are you letting me go? Oh, Margaret realized she hadn't put her words together very well. No, not at all, Camilla. It's just that I want you to know I appreciate you. A gust of air came out in relief, and the maid nodded. Of course, miss. Is there anything else that you need for the moment? In truth, Margaret almost asked Camilla simply to sit down across from her, to just be there with her for a while. She'd spent a lot of time with Camilla over the years, and the fact that they were similar in age had made them a bit closer than they might have been otherwise as mistress and servant. The weather was cold and bleary outside, but it was nothing compared to the cold worry that had settled like a stone in Margaret's heart. She could even see herself asking Camilla for advice in this particular case, but it wouldn't be fair. Camilla couldn't know just how bad things had become, and Margaret didn't want her to be involved. The poor girl ought to go off to a different house before Margaret's name blemished her record, but then word would get out about Margaret's problem. It was another brick wall, and they were surrounding her at this point. No, she finally said, much more softly and gently than the way she'd spoken the word just a few minutes before. Thank you so very much, Camilla. I'm sure you have other things to attend to, and I don't want to keep you. Very well. Do let me know if you need anything. Camilla slipped out of the room, closing the door so softly that it barely bumped against the jamb. That left Margaret alone with the steaming soup and tea. She sipped and ate for a while, knowing she had to keep up her strength and energy regardless of anything else that was happening. If anyone were to suspect, well then, she might be in even more trouble. She eyed the newspaper that Camilla had left. Margaret read it occasionally, taking the sheets of newsprint as her father set them aside on the breakfast table, skimming over the headlines for anything that interested her. There was always plenty about politics and finances, topics that were as boring as they were important. Now, Margaret thought perhaps she understood just what her father's tactic all these years had been in reading every word. There was knowledge to be had here, an understanding of the world. Maybe there was pertinent information contained within that could help her now. Carefully, she picked it up, trying to ignore how her gut churned nauseously over what the paper might be reporting on. Time ticked slowly away as she read through each page, losing herself in information. She had always been a fast learner, and though her tutors had complained endlessly about her behavior, they'd certainly praised her mind. Margaret was not a simple woman who longed only for fine dresses and pretty shoes. She wanted to know everything, to experience everything. It had earned her a bit of a reputation, but it was one she was willing to have. She reached the back page and folded the paper, setting it down with a sigh. Nothing pertinent to her situation was contained within. Margaret folded the paper and set it back down on the tray. She picked up her cup of tea. It'd gone cold now, but it was still enjoyable. It was still a sign of kindness, and Margaret valued it. As she sipped, her eyes landed on the back of the paper. She hadn't read that part since it was simply the classified section. Advertisements weren't going to make a difference in her life, and yet she felt herself drawn to one down near the bottom. Hardworking rancher in Colorado 37 seeks a wife of good personality and loyal heart to assist in running a household. Must be intelligent, respectable, and willing to learn the ways of a ranch life. Margaret frowned as she read the advertisement again, and then her brow furrowed as she went over it a third time. She'd never paid particular attention to matrimonial ads before. They simply hadn't applied. Why should she care about a rancher in Colorado who wanted a wife? But that was before. Things had changed. She desperately needed some way to resolve this impasse. And perhaps this was just it. No. Margaret pushed the paper aside. This was ridiculous. It would never work. Or would it? The impulsivity for which she was renowned soon took over. Margaret was on her feet, nearly upsetting the tea tray as she dashed to her desk. She dug in the drawer for a clean sheet of paper and her inkwell, items that simply weren't used as much as her mother would have preferred. She bent over the desk and wrote hastily, but she quickly noticed that it wouldn't do. This man wouldn't even give her letter a second glance if it looked as though a child had written it. Her hands were shaking. She was shaking down to her very bones, actually, but she forced herself to sit in the desk chair. Margaret found a clean sheet of paper and took several breaths before she started again. The back of her mind was busy trying to come up with all the reasons that it wouldn't work. It would perhaps take too long, but that was a risk she'd have to accept. There were no other excuses she could make. Margaret signed her name with a flourish and rang the bell for Camilla. Chapter 2. Sweetheart, you've had a lot of wild plans in your life, but I think this just about tops all of them. Peter Bennett leaned back in his chair, a habit that irritated his wife and made the butler tsk about the scuffed chair legs. I just don't think I quite understand. I know, Margaret admitted. I'm asking you not to try too hard to understand. This is simply something that I need to do. Rosa Bennett tipped her head back. You know we've certainly indulged you on all of your wild pursuits, my dear. Do you remember when you wanted that pony cart? I thought for sure that'd be the end of you, and that would certainly be the end of me, but you proved yourself rather quickly. Still, I do have to say this is a surprise. I mean, what will people say when I tell them? That's just it, Mother. I don't want you to tell anyone. There had been many long hours up in her room while she waited for the reply to the letter she'd sent, and Margaret had gone over every aspect of it in her mind. She could do this and take care of herself. The best way to take care of her parents was to insist that they keep quiet. I've always gone off and done whatever I pleased, right? Nobody would be surprised in the least to know that I've done so again, without any permission and without any forwarding address. Now her mother's face pinched with concern. Don't be absurd. Margaret was beginning to feel desperate. She could have simply slipped off into the night, but she couldn't bear to leave her parents in that much turmoil. They'd been more than kind to her. They'd given her everything she'd ever needed or wanted, and most of the time they didn't even question what she asked for. It seemed too cruel to just disappear on them. But now she wondered if perhaps that would have been the better option. Margaret took her mother's hand and squeezed it in her own. "I'm very serious, Mother. Deadly serious." "Don't speak that way," Rosa replied softly, pleading. But it was the truth, and Margaret saw no way around it. She looked at the two of them. "I have to do this, not just for myself, but for the two of you as well. I need you to trust me on that, and I need you to pretend that you don't have a clue where I've gone. In a way, you won't. I don't intend to leave behind the least bit of information as to exactly where I am. If anyone asks, you could tell them I've gone to visit my cousin in New York." Her mother frowned. "You don't have any cousins in New York." "Precisely." Anyone who was looking for her would start off on the wrong trail, at least for a time. Mr. Bennett drummed his fingers on the table. His eyes narrowed, and his mustache twitched. "If this has anything to do with what I think it does, then you ought to let me handle it. I'm a wealthy man, and I have plenty of resources at my disposal." "Not enough of them," Margaret maintained. "Not for this. Money isn't going to fix this, Father." Peter Bennett's brow furrowed, and Margaret wondered if she'd said too much. "What is going on? Are you in some kind of trouble?" Margaret laughed and fanned a hand in dismissal. "Papa, please, give me some credit." "Then why the secrecy, Margaret? Are you—" His cheeks darkened, and he looked nervously at his wife. "Is there something else you are hiding from us? Because whatever it is, we will deal with it." She had to swallow hard to try and dislodge the lump in her throat. Of course, her parents would stand by her if she was in the family way, but on this occasion she wasn't prepared to risk their safety. She laid a hand on his forearm and gave him a warm smile. "Not in any trouble, Papa. I'm making a trip, just for a short while." "My?" Mrs. Bennett sighed. The chair legs struck the polished wooden floor as her father sat upright and fixed her with a stare that made even the most hostile man quake in his boots. "Promise me?" Margaret smiled to hide the lie, offering up a prayer of forgiveness as she nodded. "I do understand that this is difficult." Margaret rose from her seat at the breakfast table and looked around the room. It was always bright and sunny, and the sunlight that now reflected off the snow outside only increased the effect. It almost looked surreal, with the delicate china cups and the pale blue wallpaper. It was something she might have dreamed up if she hadn't already had it in real life. "I wanted to let you know, both because it seemed like the right thing to do, and so that you wouldn't send the authorities out looking for me. I'm leaving tonight." "Then I'll drive you to the station myself," her father offered, letting all four legs of his chair fall to the floor. "No, you won't. Everyone in Boston will know that I'm leaving, and that can't happen. Not even the servants here should know exactly what's going on. I didn't even tell Camilla." It hurt her to do so, since Camilla had been so wonderful to her. If the circumstances had been different, if she'd simply been heading off to get married to one of Boston society's elite, as everyone expected her to, then she'd bring her maid with her. That wouldn't happen now. She'd leave her behind, feeling just as confused and hurt as the rest of the staff. "I'm going upstairs to pack now." Mrs. Bennett caught her arm as she turned away from the table. "Darling, you're our only child. You've always had that fiery spirit in you, and I've often thanked God that you did. I think that's the only reason you're not in the cemetery with all of those sweet little babes we buried over the years. I'd never try to hold you back, but I'll ask again if you truly think it's necessary." Margaret could see the worry in her mother's face. That wasn't a common emotion for Rose Bennett. The woman had so little in the world to worry about, what with having a kind husband and so much money at her disposal. But Margaret knew those worries would get worse, much worse, if she stayed. "Yes, Mother, it is. I promise I'll be safe, though, and I'll write to you as soon as I'm able." Without another word, Margaret cut through the kitchen and dashed up the back stairs. She quickly closeted herself in her room. She had to pack as quickly as possible, and she would have to be ruthless. The gorgeous dark pink ball gown she'd worn just a few months ago would be staying behind, despite how much it cost and how well it fit. She wouldn't be needing things like that where she was going, and the delicate dancing slippers would stay with it. Margaret shuffled frantically through her wardrobe for only the most drab and practical of outfits, something that she realized she had very little of. Holding a wool dress in her hands, she frowned angrily at all the pretty lace trimmings. It looked nice, but that wouldn't do. Anyone who saw her would understand in an instant that she wasn't a simple rancher's wife. Though Margaret had never been particularly adept at sewing, it was a much easier manner to rip the stitches with a pair of scissors and toss the lace aside, packing away the plain blue wool. This action inspired her to modify a few other pieces of clothing. Beads and sequins clacked against the floor as they were freed of the threads that held them in place. She carefully picked out braiding and embroidery. Some of the silks simply couldn't be worked with because the quality and the patterns of the fabric itself were too fine for the life she was about to embark on. This left her with a carefully curated collection in her valise, as well as a pile of discarded material. Margaret put it all in a basket, hoping that Camilla might find good use for it. Finally, in the back of her wardrobe, she pulled out a brown wool walking outfit. The skirt could be bustled in the back or let out, which would make the train ride a little more comfortable. There were some frills of lace around the edge, but the muddy brown of them hardly made them noticeable. The dust ruffle around the bottom of the skirt would be a practical thing, and right now she had to choose that over fashion. Margaret currently couldn't remember what ever made her buy this particular piece, but at least it would be put to use now. She made sure she tucked the letter she'd received deep into her back, not wanting to leave a trace behind. Donning her gloves, she slipped over to her parents' chambers as she'd arranged with them. They simply couldn't do this in front of any servants. "I do love you. As I said, I'll write when I can." Turning away from the tears in her mother's eyes, she made her escape out the back door and walked swiftly to the train station. She boarded quickly and took her seat. She watched through the windows until the train finally pulled away from the station, and then she began studying the other passengers on the train with her. She didn't know any of them. That ought to make her feel better, but Margaret found that it only made her more uneasy. It meant she didn't know what any of them were capable of. She finally leaned back in her seat as they left Massachusetts, but it wasn't until they'd reached the Midwest that she finally forced her shoulders to relax. She was getting further and further from home. She and her parents were much safer now, but a whole new world awaited her, and she hadn't given herself very much time to think about it. Margaret had only been concerned about getting out of Boston, and the rest didn't matter. Now that it was right in front of her as the train sped down the tracks, she wondered if this was something she was truly capable of. Well, it had to be. She never worked a day in her life, certainly, but much of what she did for fun was more work than other ladies were willing to do. They didn't want to ride their horses at breakneck speed and see just how high they could jump, nor were they interested in going to the races or trying out a bicycle. Many of the other women her age were more inclined to go for a walk, and they might be coerced into playing a game of lawn tennis if they felt particularly energetic. If the world was mostly made of women like that, then surely Margaret could make it in the West. The train sped into Colorado, and her confidence grew. It was true that she didn't know this man from Adam, and it was true that there was no guarantee their marriage would be a love match. She might very much hate being a rancher's wife. None of that mattered because that didn't have anything to do with her goal. She only had to keep herself and her family safe, and the rest could fly out the window for all she cared. Chugging up into the mountains, the train slowed as it carried her closer to her destination. Margaret smiled to herself as she admired the town of Grand Ridge. It didn't look very grand at all, from what she could see. The roads looked to be packed earth. The town shivered under a frosty coating, with the mucky roads churned up by wagon wheels, leaving a muddy brown ribbon winding through the middle of the cluster of buildings. The buildings were small, and they certainly hadn't been built by a reputable construction company like the one her father owned. They'd been cobbled together out of what materials could be had here, and the rough log walls looked odd compared to the limestone and brick she was used to. Margaret would have had to crane her head to look up and see the tops of the buildings back in Boston, but out here, not a single one was more than 2 stories high. Spirals of chimney smoke drifted into the air. Beyond the town, spikes of trees peeked out from the snow-laden hills that vanished into the clouds. The train let out an exhausted sigh of steam as it came to a halt in front of the platform. It was protected by a roofline that stretched out from a tiny building that was laughable compared to the monstrous train stations she was used to. At least, there would be very little confusion when it came time to find Dalton Sinclair. At that thought, all the tension and worry that she thought she'd left behind came rushing suddenly back to her. Margaret could make her plans and set things in motion. She could write letters and buy train tickets. She could pack her bags and sneak away. But the truth of it all was that she had to rely on this man for her future. Margaret stepped carefully down onto the platform. It took only a moment before she locked eyes with a tall man, one who stood a bit back from the crowd and watched over the heads of the other passengers and those who'd come to meet them. She didn't know quite how she knew that it was him, but she knew. Margaret stepped up, reminding herself that she was the boldest woman in her circle back home. Dalton Sinclair. Yes, ma'am. He tugged the edge of his hat before he reached out to take her bag. His deep green eyes studied her face carefully as he did so. You must be Margaret. I am. She found that she could hardly breathe, though she'd never been one to lace her corset too tightly. It's very nice to meet you. You as well. This is my mother, Ernestine Sinclair. He gestured toward the woman who stood at his side. She was so short that Margaret had hardly even noticed her at first. Once Dalton introduced her, Margaret remembered that he'd mentioned her in his letter. Widowed, she'd come down from Wyoming to live with her son. It was hard to believe that a woman of such diminutive size could have created a man of such height and with such wide shoulders as the one who stood next to her right now. Her small frame was only slightly heightened by the bright pink silk flower that poked out of her bonnet. How very nice to meet you, Mrs. Sinclair. And it's so very nice to meet you as well. Mrs. Sinclair pulled Margaret's polite handshake into a warm hug. I do hope you had a nice trip on the train, and I'm looking forward to getting to know you. It's not always easy being the only woman rattling around in that ranch house. Margaret laughed despite all the fears that had been haunting her for the last few weeks. It was a lovely trip, thank you. Dalton cleared his throat. I'm sure you're tired and you're ready to rest up for a bit, but I thought we'd stop at the inn for a meal before we made the journey out of town. Would you be up for that? Had she even eaten anything in the last few days? Margaret knew it had been very little. Yes, that would be nice. He was polite enough to offer her his arm. It felt strange to slip her hand into the crook of his elbow. She gave one backward look at the departing train before they headed down the main street. She'd done it. Chapter 3. Is there a newspaper office here? Dalton looked down at Margaret. He'd expected plenty of questions about this little town, particularly since she'd come from a much bigger city, but this wouldn't have been one of them he'd imagined to be first on his mind. We don't have a printer here, but we do get the paper in from Boulder. We should be able to pick one up at the inn. Oh, I see. Was that a bit of disappointment in her face? I was just interested in news from back home, but I suppose they wouldn't write about anything that happens back in Boston. That just depends on how big the story is, Dalton reasoned. They certainly write about events from all over the country, but you're probably right. There's no guarantee that there would be any articles about Boston. It felt so awkward to walk right down Main Street with this beautiful woman on his arm. He should have just insisted that they go straight back to the ranch instead of doing what his mother suggested and taking a meal at the inn. There was plenty of perfectly good food at home, and then they wouldn't have everyone staring at them. Margaret wore a muted brown dress, something practical for traveling, and yet the other folks in Grand Ridge seemed to know automatically that she wasn't one of them. The residents, a mix of miners, ranchers, fur trappers, and families, moved about wrapped in heavy coats, their breath visible in the frigid air. Perhaps he'd have to buy her a coat if she didn't have one, though she didn't appear to be unfazed by the cold. Instead, her gaze roamed the town avidly, drawing attention. The blacksmith stopped ringing his hammer as they walked by, turning his head as he tried to figure out who she was. A couple of young girls stared up at her. Their mothers walked along behind them, eyeing Margaret critically. Dalton knew that Grandridge was overall a wonderful town to live in, but it always took them a while to get used to strangers. "Here we are," Mother announced as they walked up the steps and into the inn. "You two go get yourselves a table. I'm going into the back to talk to Mrs. Ragsdale while I have the chance." The inn was favored by both travelers and locals alike. The interior was rustically simple, with gleaming floors and plain fabrics covering the tables. "Mrs. Ragsdale has become a good friend of hers," Dalton explained as he guided Margaret toward a table, making sure to pick one near the back and far away from the window. They were already under intense scrutiny from the citizenry, so there was no need to put themselves on display. "She likes to visit with her when she comes into town." "How nice." Margaret took her seat, her bright eyes darting around the room and touching on every other face there. "Did you say we could get a paper here?" "Yes, just a moment." He excused himself and went over to the counter. "Fresh in from Boulder," Mr. Ragsdale announced proudly when Dalton picked one up. "I'd say they're still warm from the presses, but I'm afraid this cold weather has taken care of that." "I'm sure you're right." Dalton dropped his coins into Mr. Ragsdale's hand. "Say, who's the pretty miss you've brought in?" the older man asked, leaning to the side so that he could see around Dalton. "I don't think I've ever seen her around these parts." "She's just in from Boston." Dalton hoped he wouldn't need to explain any further than that. Plenty of men who were this far out on the frontier resorted to finding wives back east. There simply weren't any women out here to choose from, save for a widow here and there. In that sense, he had nothing to be ashamed of. 7%. Even his mother approved, and she would certainly be happy to see him married. She'd be even happier if she had a few grandchildren playing around her feet. Only time would tell, however, if it would work this time. "I see." Mr. Ragsdale glanced from side to side before he leaned forward over the counter and gave Dalton a fatherly look. "She's a pretty one, Dalton. I know you're a smart and level-headed man, but you be careful. I've heard some of the stories about these women. They're not always who they say they are." Dalton held back a sigh because he knew Mr. Ragsdale was only trying to help. The old man knew every customer, where they were from, and in what room they were staying. He certainly hadn't forgotten what happened to Dalton a few years ago, but he seemed worried that Dalton had already forgotten that lesson. "I know. I'll keep my eyes open." "Good man. You let me know if you need anything." Mr. Ragsdale gave him a wink. Returning to the table, Dalton saw that Margaret was still carefully studying everyone else at the inn. Her eyes drifted out the window and then back to him, and they lightened some when she spotted the newspaper. "Thank you so very much." She quickly flipped it open and scanned through the pages. He raised his brows. "Are you reading it that fast?" Her laugh was the bright sound of a bell. "I'm just skimming the headlines to see what I might want to read." That laughter died off too quickly as she refolded the paper and set it on the table. "I'm afraid it's not much, but I might look through it again later." Dalton nodded and tried to decide exactly how he should start the conversation he knew he needed to have with this woman. "Here you are, dearies." Mrs. Ragsdale interrupted his thoughts as she put 2 big bowls of chicken and dumplings on the table. "Cooked up fresh today. As you know, Dalton, my dumplings are the best around. Say, are you going to introduce us properly?" The woman's inquisitive gaze was assessing Margaret. Dalton eyed his future wife closely as he made the introductions. Her smile seemed genuine, and she scored herself a few extra marks by engaging the other woman in recipe talk. "She seems nice," Margaret exclaimed as the innkeeper's wife moved on, her attention once more perusing the room. "Salt of the earth, the Ragsdales. They arrived here with a wagon train, took over the trading post for a while. The inn was built when they heard that the railway was going to be coming through these parts. Margaret smiled, picking up her spoon and sampling the dumpling. She's right. The best I ever had. She doesn't lie, Dalton murmured, trying to think of a way to have the difficult conversation that had been niggling at him since he'd agreed to wed this woman. He knew that he'd just have to say it. If he dallied too long, then it would be too late. Margaret, I'd like to talk to you about our arrangement. Certainly. She folded her hands in her lap and gazed at him expectantly. Ah. All the words he'd ever known drifted out of his mind and disappeared somewhere in the large room. She was looking at him with such attention, truly interested in whatever it was he might have to say. Those blue eyes of hers enthralled him. It threw him off, especially since she'd spent every other second glancing around the room. She was a beauty. That was the truth. I'd like to do something a little bit unusual, he finally began. I'd like for us to take the next 2 weeks to get to know each other before we go visit the preacher and officially become husband and wife. Margaret blinked. Her shoulders made the smallest movement backward, but she quickly recovered and recomposed herself. That's very kind of you, Dalton, but there's really no need as far as I'm concerned. I came out here with the specific intention of marrying you, and I don't see any reason why we should delay. She gave him a perky smile. Anyone else would have been dazzled by that smile, but Dalton thought he saw a bit of desperation around the edges of it. That let him know that he was making the right decision about waiting 2 weeks. Once bitten, twice shy. I understand, but I would feel better if we took a moment to get to know each other. Grand Ridge is a far cry from Boston. I want you to be sure that this is right for both of us. As I mentioned in my letters, my mother lives with me at the ranch. There are extra bedrooms, so there would be plenty of room for you to have your privacy while still being properly chaperoned. She once again took a quick peek toward the window, though it was only for a moment. It's a very nice offer, of course, but it would mean we'd have to come back to town once we're ready. It might be more efficient if we simply have it taken care of. Dalton's fingers curled around the napkin in his lap. Margaret had written such a nice letter, one that made him hope this time would be different. Now that she was here, he was starting to think he'd been fooled again. Suspicion slithered into his heart. That would seem reasonable, but I don't mind taking an extra trip into town. But, her eyes dropped to the table for a moment. Won't that take you away from all the work that needs to be done on the ranch? I told you in my letters that I've never set foot on a ranch much like you described, but I know my way around a horse and I'm a quick learner. I'm assuming you're a very busy man. He allowed a small smile and saw the effect it had on her, with the fluttering at the base of her throat. That was a good sign, wasn't it? It's not so busy at this time of year, he conceded. She rolled her full lips inwards, as though getting ready to say something further, and he leaned in, cutting her off. Margaret, I'll be honest with you. You aren't the first woman I've brought out to Colorado as a potential wife. Oh, the lively light that had come into her eyes as she'd argued with him dimmed. It hurt him to have to explain all of this. If there was a chance that the two of them truly could find wedded bliss, then this seemed like a terrible way to begin. It could only be insulting to her, and it was embarrassing for him. Now that he had no choice, it was best to just get it all out. There are many men in situations like mine. We need wives to help run the household, but there are simply none to be had out here. And so, we turn to the East. Unfortunately, some women see that as a way to make a quick dollar on an unsuspecting bachelor who doesn't know any better. I've heard of men who married as soon as their betrothed stepped off the train, only to find that their new wives had run off into the sunset with whatever of their money and possessions they could get their hands on. Did that happen to you? She tipped her head slightly to the side, again giving him that keen sense of interest. Dalton hadn't met a woman this bold, but maybe it was for the best that she wasn't shying away from the topic. Not exactly. I did have a woman come out to Grand Ridge, but she happened to meet a gentleman on the train that she liked much better. She was only here long enough to catch the next train. So you see, I'm not opposed to the inconvenience of coming back into town for a wedding ceremony. I'd much prefer that than to find that I don't have a bride at all. She sat in silence for a moment, her lips pursed. His scent. Is that why you seemed a little relieved that I paid for my own ticket to get here? Dalton chuckled, bold and direct. She was surely going to keep him on his toes, providing she stuck around, of course. It wasn't a test, though I have to admit it intrigued me as to where you got the funds so quickly. She grinned then. I have savings, Mr. Sinclair. I don't suppose it's any sort of consolation to you, but I'm not interested in money, and I don't have any plans to go anywhere else, and I've not met anyone even remotely as intriguing as you on the journey here. Dalton sat back then, considering her. She stared back at him, the challenging light back and blazing in her eyes. Did he want a wife who spoke as freely as she did? He rubbed at his chin, wondering if he had indeed bitten off more than he could chew with her. Are you always this frank? Yes. His fingertips drummed the table. A big part of him wanted to claim her for his own, especially considering the appreciative looks she was drawing from the prospectors sitting in the corner. Even in the drab dress, she stood out with her copper hair and porcelain skin. But he'd always been a careful and chary man, weighing up his choices. He'd chosen a path of caution, and he would stick to it, for now. I hope you'll understand that I'd like to wait before we go before the preacher. Dalton felt almost cruel in having to deal with her this way. If Margaret truly had only the purest intentions for coming here, then she was paying for the transgressions of others. That was hardly fair, but he couldn't see a way around it. Margaret leveled her gaze at him and nodded. I understand. She leaned forward, the action intimate, drawing him closer so that he was focused only on her. You'd best eat your dumplings, as we're being watched, she added in a whisper, her head swaying toward the corner where Mrs. Ragsdale and his mother were ogling at them. He hadn't even noticed his mother had come back into the dining, yet his watchful fiancée hadn't missed a trick. Outspoken and incredibly observant. The woman was an enigma. Margaret grinned at him then, scooping up more stew. Dalton stared at the bowl in front of him, his mind suddenly on a lot more than the contents of it. He wasn't sure he'd even last to the town limits, let alone all the back to the ranch without kissing her. Suddenly, 2 weeks seemed a ridiculously long time to him. Chapter 4. Ah, it's a beautiful day. Ernestine tilted her nose up as the late winter wind breezed across her cheeks. It feels good to get away from the ranch for a bit. How often do you come into town? Margaret had been surprised when Dalton's mother had asked her to come along for the trip. She'd imagined that once ranchers and their families were ensconced on their farms, they didn't make it back to civilization for quite some time. She wasn't sure how she felt about knowing they could get to town so easily. It was convenient, certainly, and it was good to know that the Sinclairs felt it was safe enough for the two women to go on their own. But could that make it easier for someone to find her? Oh, whenever I can. Ernestine grinned, pushing up the deep wrinkles on her face. I love Dalton's ranch. It's a beautiful place, and there's always plenty to do. I don't like being bored. I like to be busy. But I get a little itchy when I've been cooped up too long, and the winter is much worse for that. Fortunately, we're past the worst of it for now. We've got a bit of mud to deal with, but the flowers will be coming soon. All the new growth will show bright green on the trees, and everyone will be in a much better mood, including my son, she added pointedly. Margaret knew this was Ernestine's way of asking how they were getting along. She lived right there in the house with them, but she still wanted more information. If that's him in a foul mood, then I've seen much worse. Is that so? Realizing that she'd already said more than she should, Margaret steered the conversation back toward Dalton. I know there's very little of the ranch that he can show me at the moment, what with the weather, but he's been very kind in talking to me about what he's done to improve the land and what the neighbors are like. It was a stiff sort of kindness, something more like being polite. Margaret could hardly blame him, considering what he'd told her about his past. She knew she just had to be patient, even if it was difficult. Just as she'd guessed, He was busy with jobs about the ranch house, mending fencing and repairing a leak in the roof. Tasks that he said he just didn't have time to do come the summer months, so he had to wait until his work had slowed down some. It meant that they'd been circling each other in the last few days since her arrival, not really spending much time together. Margaret sensed he was avoiding her, though he'd been nothing but civil and polite. The cart rolled into town. The snow had receded since she was last here, a pointer to the milder weather, allowing her to get a better look at the town that emerged from beneath the frigid blanket. The town was nestled in a basin surrounded by towering pines and rugged peaks. The streets were busy, the narrow main thoroughfare lined with stubby wooden buildings, each with the title emblazoned in bright lettering across the front. "Here we are." Ernestine pulled up in front of the general store. "I'll let you work on your list of items, and I'll take care of a few other errands." The spry old woman disappeared quickly across the street. Margaret stepped into the general store. She fingered the list in her pocket, one that had mostly been written by Ernestine, as she wasn't sure what was needed to manage a household. She eyed the boxes, barrels, and crates that crowded the floor. Shelves and bins were stacked up the wall, and items were tacked in between with hooks or nails. The entirety of the place was only a fraction of the size of a shop she might visit back in Boston, and yet someone had packed in as many items as possible. "No, I'm afraid that simply won't do." A young woman at the counter shook her head. She held her shoulders straight as she talked to the boy behind the counter. "I told you I needed a pound of flour, and I saw that you only measured out 3/4. I'm on a very limited budget, and I won't be paying for flour that I'm not getting." "Did I?" The boy put the small sack on the scale and nodded. "I suppose so." When the other woman had finished up her purchase, she turned. Margaret expected the same reaction she'd gotten from everyone else here so far. It hadn't been difficult to see that everyone was curious about the newcomer, and perhaps they didn't feel all too happy about having a stranger in their midst. Instead, the other woman smiled and reached out a hand. "Hello, I'm Sarah Philpott. I don't believe we've met." Margaret was so surprised by this friendly introduction that she merely blinked at the other woman for a moment. "Margaret Bennett. My apologies. I usually have a quicker tongue than that, but I'm still getting used to how everything works here in Grand Ridge. I've only just come in a week ago." Sarah laughed. "You're not long after me, I'm afraid. I'm the new school teacher. It's not easy to get to know people around here." "I have to agree with that, and living outside of town makes it even more difficult." Margaret had found herself smiling as she talked with Sarah, but that smile faded as she realized just how lonely she'd become. She had every reason for being here, but a part of her missed the whirlwind of society that used to surround her. "Why don't you get your items taken care of, and then the two of us can stop over at the inn for some tea?" Sarah suggested. "Mrs. Ragsdale makes some delicious little tea cakes, though you might not expect it." "Actually, I'm in town with I suppose I should call her my mother-in-law, though I am not yet wed. The ranch where we live is a ways out of town." Sarah's eyes sparkled. "Golly, that sounds like a story worthy of sharing. I have my wagon here in town. I'd be happy to give you a ride back to where you live if you like." She intended on building a life here. It wouldn't do well to hide away, nor was it in her nature. "That would be lovely." Margaret eagerly gave her list to the counter boy, watching him carefully after overhearing Sarah's interaction with him. She waved Ernestine down and explained her plans before she headed to the inn. Sarah was lively and quick-witted. She laughed easily, and she didn't hesitate to say what she truly thought. Margaret found her tea getting cold and her cakes going uneaten simply because she was having such a good time. It was only after they'd been there for a while that Margaret realized other people were giving them curious looks. "I think we might be making a bit of a scene." She dampened her laughter and deliberately stirred a cube of sugar into her tea, knowing she needed to blend in here. "Don't mind them," Sarah advised. "This is a small town. Many of the folks have already been here a long time. I understand there were a few newcomers who came through over the last several years who've turned out to be robbers or shysters, and it made everyone a little leery. They start to warm up eventually, although I'm only just now starting to find that out. Though Margaret knew it didn't matter whether or not she ever truly fit in here in Grand Ridge, it was nice to know it could happen eventually. After Sarah took her back to the ranch, Margaret accepted the invite to join her again for tea at the inn. Sarah came by the ranch one evening after the children were done with school, and Ernestine insisted that she stay for dinner. In person, Margaret took the cart and some of Ernestine's homemade rolls over to the schoolhouse for her a few days later. It was wonderful to have someone to talk to, someone who understood what it was like to be an outsider. Sarah became a fast friend, something that had been absent of late in the life of Margaret Bennett. However, there was still a part of Margaret that held back. "You're a rather independent woman, aren't you?" Sarah asked one afternoon as they walked down the long lane that ran from the road up to the ranch house. The cold air still held a slap, though it wasn't as stinging as when she'd first arrived in Grand Ridge. It felt good to get out of the house. "Is it that obvious?" Margaret asked with a laugh. "Oh, I think you try to keep it under wraps," Sarah replied with a wink. "But I get this feeling that there's a lot more to you than a woman who simply decided to leave the city and come be a rancher's wife." Margaret wondered if Dalton could sense the same thing. "You might be right. I do understand," Sarah continued. "I didn't see myself as a modest school teacher in a small mountain town. I wanted to do something much bigger. I don't know what exactly. My dreams changed weekly. But my father decided I was far too stubborn and wild. He was going to make sure I settled down by marrying me off to a distant cousin, a revolting man who was known to be abusive and intolerant. That was exactly what my father thought I needed, and so I left. I can't say that I've regretted it at all." Though Margaret had never planned to tell anyone, the past pressed in on her, squeezing her chest so that she had to inhale sharply. She'd tried her best to try and forget about it, to put it out of her mind. She'd left, hadn't she? Moved on, put as much distance between herself and danger as she could. Yet she missed her parents, her friends, even Camilla. She hadn't even had the chance to explain to them all why she'd left so abruptly. Sarah looked at her, and Margaret ducked. She'd managed to survive thus far because she'd kept her secret. But under the steady gaze of curiosity, Margaret felt the words gathering in her throat. To share her fears, to have just one person to speak to, frankly, would feel wonderful. She had here someone who might help her, someone who could understand in a way that no one else could. More than once, she'd almost blurted out what happened when Dalton queried her avid interest in the papers from back home. He'd proven so far to be a kind and patient man, even if he watched her with the suspicion of a feral cat. But a man could never really understand what she'd gone through. "I only hope that I don't regret coming here." Her words were said absently. Sarah tipped her head, her ash-blonde hair shining where it peeked out from under her bonnet. "I don't think that's a comment about Dalton." "No," Margaret admitted. "You don't have to tell me what's wrong," Sarah assured her. "But from what you've said so far, you were happy in Boston. A happy person doesn't abandon everything she knows for a tiny little town in the mountains." Margaret walked a few more steps before the tears claimed her. Sarah allowed her some time to gather herself. Then Margaret started to talk. "Much like you, coming to Colorado was more of an escape than a true choice. I had become entangled in a bit of a mess. I never saw it coming. His name was Edward." "Ah," Sarah waggled his brows. "I wondered if there would be a man involved somehow." Margaret nibbled her bottom lip. "He was dazzling, I suppose. He was different from the other men I'd been thrust at. He was controlled, and that, I suppose it was intriguing. His family was very wealthy and influential, and he was one of the most eligible bachelors in Boston. Whenever I saw him, he had women fawning over him, but he was always unaffected by their wantonness. Imagine my surprise when he set his sights on me. I assumed he'd want a wife who would run his household, not someone with a strong will and a sharp tongue. I made it perfectly clear to him that I wasn't willing to settle down just yet. I wanted to travel, to experience something other than what society told me I should be doing. He made it clear that I was going to be his wife. I was pursued, but it was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. I was drawn to him, to his innate, I would call it danger now. Our betrothal happened very quickly, but it was in secret. He said that he needed to find a way to let his parents know that he was marrying a carpenter's daughter. Though I didn't officially have a ring on my finger yet, Edward started to change, like in the novels when the cracks start to show. What I'd taken at face value to be aloofness was really heartlessness. He had a cruel streak in him that I detested. If I did something he didn't like, he'd tell me in no uncertain terms that my behavior was unacceptable. There were many promises of just how he'd handle the situation once I was his wife, and he made it clear I was getting off easy for my first offenses. He was confident I'd never break off the engagement simply because of the social embarrassment it would cause. He was heartless and cruel. Oh, how horrid! Sarah spat, anger creasing her forehead. He sounds like he'd be very good friends with Cousin Leonard. Perhaps so, but unfortunately it was even worse than that. Margaret looked out over the hilly pastures. Even here at the end of winter, with no life yet breathed back into the fields and trees, she found it beautiful in a lonely way. You see, Edward wasn't just nasty to me. It turns out that his family had become wealthy, not just by making smart business decisions and lucky investments, but also by taking down anyone who stood in their way. I saw Edward commit a terrible crime. Images of that night still flashed before her eyes now and then, intruding on her thoughts and kicking her out of her dreams. The blood on his hands, the crazed look in his eyes. Sarah rested a hand gently on Margaret's arm, and they paused as they reached the end of the lane. "I'm so glad you got away from him. I only hope that I did. I had the excuse of a batch of atrocious weather in Boston. For days, the streets were impassable. Then there was Christmas. I avoided the parties and the balls. Edward wrote to me several times. At first, he was waxing lyrical about how he needed to speak with me to discuss how we would tell our parents, and that he wanted to wed me by the spring. The letters grew more vicious when he didn't get a response. He called by the house. Thankfully, I was visiting with my mother's sister that day and wasn't there. My maid said an angry man had used dreadful language to the staff. My father wanted to know why Edward was calling on me. I made the excuse that he was a man who'd had his advances rejected, which was only a half-truth. After that day, I stayed in my room. I was racking my brain for a way to put him off the scent when I saw Dalton's advertisement. I quickly saw it as a way to keep myself safe. There's no way that Edward can track me down out here. I just worry about whether or not he's taken out his anger on my parents. I keep checking the newspaper, wondering if there will be anything that will give me a real clue as to what might be going on back home. I worry, but I think coming to Colorado was the best thing I could have done. No plinning. You could tell the police. Write to them out from out here. Margaret quickly shook her head. If I turned him in, I'm sure he'd have exacted terrible consequences on my parents. I just want to let the whole situation die a death. The longer I leave it, the safer I'll be. Edward will know that I have no desire to reveal his part in that heinous crime. She took a deep breath and let it out, watching the steam rise in the cold air. It felt good to say it all out loud to someone she trusted. Margaret only wished that it made the problem go away. Thank you for telling me. I haven't told you his last name so that it will protect you, too. Sarah tucked her arm through Margaret's. I don't need your protection. I think you did the right thing. We're strong and independent, sure, but we're also sensible. We know when it's right to live to fight another day. Margaret's smile was full of gratitude. Thank you for understanding. That's what friends are for. Now tell me more about the gorgeous Dalton and why you've not raced him up the aisle already. Chapter 5. Dalton watched as she hefted the saddle off the buckskin pony that Margaret seemed to favor whenever she went out. Her red hair was tied back from her face, revealing the long line of creamy neck and the shell of her dainty ears. Her full bottom lip was clamped between her teeth as she tried to flick the cinch back over on the saddle, and she buckled under the weight. Here. Dalton stepped out of the shadowy stall where he'd been shaking out the straw for bedding. Startled, she let out a little yelp, and the saddle thudded to the ground. For a moment, sheer terror swam in those clear blue eyes. He felt like a heel for scaring her, and the apology rushed to his lips as he bent for the saddle, lifting it easily with one hand. "It's fine," she breathed, a hand pressed to her breastbone, eyes drifting closed. I thought I was alone in here. I thought I'd much out the stall, save you a job." She blew out a breath, then turned back to where her ride was standing, patiently, no doubt waiting for his feed bucket. Dalton was about to give her a pointer on where to grab the bridle when she did it anyway. "You went back into town again?" he asked her after he'd hooked the saddle over the peg that stuck out of the barn wall. He took the bridle and hung it under the saddle. "That's every day this week. I returned a book to Sarah. She invited me to stay a while." He watched her carefully. When she finally met his wary look, his gut clenched. Here was a woman he simply couldn't wrap his head around. His body responded to her in a way that he'd never experienced before. She was quick and clever, bright and funny. She turned heads whenever she walked into a room, and not just because she was new in town. She was trying with his mother. She showed an interest in his life, in the life that she appeared to want with him. But her actions seemed measured, practiced, deliberate almost, like she was trying to curate something. She seemed so genuinely pleased to be a part of this household when he spoke to her, but her actions told him otherwise. It was as if she was always looking for something more. He couldn't put his finger on exactly what it was. He wanted very much to be what she wanted, to have the kind of marriage that could withstand the pressures of a harsh rancher's life. But he'd lay his farm against the fact that she was hiding something. "What is it?" He blinked, her soft question breaking the trance she held over him. "You've been here for more than 2 weeks." Her smile turned his inside to mush. "I'm aware of that. I'm ready to be your wife." She stepped closer to him and tipped her face up. In the glow of the oil lamp swinging on the crude wooden wall, her face stole his breath. He stared at her mouth. Desire warred inside with his driving need to be careful. "Maggie," he breathed, and her smile grew. She knew the effect that she had on him, which felt like a douse of ice water poured on him. He didn't know her life before she got here. A woman who knew the power she held over a man also knew how to wield it. The truth remained that she'd revealed very little of her life in Boston, not how she was able to afford a ticket here so quickly, nor how she'd arrived with such good quality clothing that had been hacked at with an unskilled hand. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped back. His lust ebbed, and he took another step away from her. Until he could be certain, he knew he'd have to make a tough decision. This was the best time to do it when Mother wasn't here to tell him he was wrong. "I know we had originally agreed on a 2-week trial period. I thought it might be wise to extend that for a little while, maybe a month or 2. I want you to be sure this is really what you want." She stilled, her smile falling so that she stared at him with wide eyes. "You want to delay marrying me again?" Was that fear he saw swimming behind that clear gaze? "Yes, I'll be honest with you, Margaret. I think you're a wonderful woman in many ways. Lord knows I shouldn't delay a thing for fear that someone else might come along and decide to marry you instead." "I told you, I'm not interested in anyone else." Desperation made her voice sharp. "I don't think that you're completely happy here. It's subtle, and perhaps I'm worrying too much." "You are." His shrug seemed to irritate her. "You sidestep any questions about your old life." She spread her hands. "I told you that I was a maid in a fine house, that I'd saved the money up for a new life in the West, that the kind owner gifted me clothing." He pursed his lips as the trite comments tripped off her tongue. He'd ticked her off. Watching her control her temper made him fall for her a little more. "Were you involved with another man?" He waited for the lies. Instead, she nodded. "I was. It did not work out." "Who was he?" "He was not a nice man." He lifted a brow at the sidestep. She was good at dodging the questions. It just fed into his paranoia. "Dalton, I meant what I said when I arrived. I have no intention of returning to Boston. There is nothing left there for me anymore." She snapped her mouth shut as though there were more that she wanted to say. She was lying. He could see it in how she dropped her gaze, in the subtle flush that climbed her cheeks. "If you'll forgive the comparison, I've been a rancher for a long time now. I've learned how to sense what an animal is feeling just by the way they move their body. An animal can't come right out and tell me that they're in pain or scared. It's up to me to simply know. I have to follow my instincts on these things, and I think I'm correct in following my instincts now. Life out here is hard enough. There's some part of you that isn't ready for this life. Maybe you're not ready for marriage in general, but I need my wife to be all in. And right now, you're not. That means that a part of me isn't either. He waited for her to argue, to tell him that he was wrong. He waited for the explosion of temper, or worse, the tears. There was an emotion that got banked, pushed back. She swallowed and gave him a little nod. He continued, I don't mean to hurt your feelings. I think you're a great girl, but that you're not happy. I also want to assure you that I'm not trying to call off the wedding. I'd like to continue to get to know you, and then maybe both of us can be fully ready for this. A frown clouded her face. Are you sure that you're happy with my being here? Unable to help himself, he cupped her cheek in his hand, brushing his thumb over her chin, her mouth. Perfectly happy, he told her gruffly. Very well, then. Reluctantly, he dropped his hand, though his skin tingled. He had to restrain himself from gathering her close, from following through with the instinct to make her his right now. Dalton swore he could see something simmering under the surface, something that wanted to be let out, but which she wouldn't allow. She was good at keeping it under wraps, and any other man would have been so distracted by her beauty and polite manners that he might never have noticed it. For that, Dalton could be thankful to the other woman who'd left him in the dust. It was because of her that he was paying much better attention this time. Thank you for understanding. After a long moment, she nodded. Of course. What's a couple more months? When I'm planning on a life here. You know, I'm looking forward to seeing what the ranch looks like in the spring. It won't be long now. Green shoots are starting to poke through, up on the trails out the back. The meadow hillside will be like a carpet with flowers in 6 weeks or so. Her wistful smile was tantalizing. I should very much like to see that. We can ride out there, tomorrow if you like. The blooms won't be out, but the trails are clear enough for a novice to ride now. Yes, yes, please. Beyond the barn across the yard, his mother was shouting them both. That's supper, she said. He nodded. I'll finish up in here if you want to go get washed up. Tell Ma I'll be along shortly. He watched her leave and called himself a fool for denying himself a taste of her mouth. He wondered if the time would ever come when she'd drop the wall that she'd built around her low enough to let him in. The buckskin stamped his foot impatiently, and Dalton let out a breath. Yeah, I'm getting to it. Chapter 6. Letting Sarah in on her secret only made their friendship grow stronger. Margaret now knew that Sarah understood the reasoning behind every choice she made. She never questioned why Margaret would often turn and look behind her, or why she studied everyone else in town just as closely as they studied her. She was starting to see, however, that the town folk of Grand Ridge were already beginning to accept her. Good day, Miss Bennett. Miss Philpott. The doctor's wife called from behind the short fence in front of her yard. She was turning over the soil in her vegetable garden with a shovel. It's a beautiful day. Indeed it is, Sarah replied with a smile. We've just come into town to see this traveling show that I heard was coming through. It's the only thing my students will talk about. Ah, yes. Mrs. Weston stabbed her shovel into the earth and leaned a bit on the handle. It's just out on the west side of town. I haven't gone to see it myself, and there are a few folks who aren't too happy about having them stop here, but you ladies have fun. What are you smiling about? Sarah asked as they went on. Margaret let out a light laugh. Just a week ago, she glared at me with as much friendliness as a grizzly bear, but today she spoke like we were old friends. You see? I told you they'd warm up to you in time. After all, there's no reason for them not to like you. You're a nice, reputable woman. You've come here to marry a nice, reputable man. I think Ernestine has probably been saying some rather nice things about you, too. She seems very hopeful that you and her son will become happily married so that she might have some grandchildren to entertain herself with. Her son has to get around to proposing, Margaret reminded her. He will, Sarah replied. Of course, you could solve everything by just telling him. Margaret pictured the judgment on Dalton's face. He's already as antsy as a debutant at her first ball. The last thing I need to do is scare the man off forever by telling him I was involved with what he's probably perceived to be Boston's equivalent of the Bowery Boys. Sarah sighed. I don't think you're giving him enough credit. He knows I'm hiding something. But if you just need to be protected from this ex-fiancé of yours by way of marriage, can't you marry, I don't know, anyone? Margaret went quiet and Sarah stopped, cocking her head. Margaret fidgeted under her friend's stare. Oh, I see. You don't just want anyone. No, I don't. You love him? Margaret wasn't sure when it had happened. She'd been both terrified and furious when Dalton had revealed his reluctance to wed her. She wasn't sure the best way to play it, demand that he bend to her will, or simply beg him to marry her. She knew two things for certain, that a careful man like Dalton Sinclair wouldn't want her if he knew that she'd stepped out with a criminal, and that she wasn't prepared to marry anyone else because she loved him. I do. Sarah shook her head. You've got yourself into a pickle, have you not? Margaret laughed then, surprised that she still had humor left. I thought that by coming out here, my problems would be solved. Have you written to your parents? I did. You put down a good argument for it, Margaret admitted. Did it help you feel better? It felt good to be able to let them know that I was safe and well. I even told them about you, although of course I didn't even mention your name. I put a false return address on the envelope, like you said, using a town that likely doesn't even exist. Still, I worry. What are you going to do? She looked at her friend. Her eyes roving the squat buildings that sat along the road where Sarah's small cottage was. The air was scented with fresh pine and a hint of wood smoke, so different from the place where she'd grown up. Right now, I'm taking my girl to the fair, she announced, hooking her arm through Sarah's. Running away again? Sarah teased. Not exactly. I just don't know how to tell him without scaring him off. I don't even know that telling him will be the right thing. He has a strong moral code. The last thing I want to do is get him embroiled in this. You're not asking him to commit a crime, Sarah reminded her, but I am asking him to keep a secret about a crime, which would be implication enough. I shouldn't have told you, really. Sarah laid her head on her shoulder. I'm glad that you told me, but this Edward character won't find you. How can he when no one knows where you are? That's true enough, Margaret allowed. They rounded the corner and could just see the traveling show at the end of the street. It was a collage of brightly colored tents and signs. I just worry that if the Sinclairs ever find out the truth about me and we're married, Dalton will throw me over. I'm not sure I could survive that. He wouldn't do that, I'm almost certain. Margaret smiled thinly at her friend. The key word in her sentence was almost. So far, Dalton hadn't acted predictably about anything. She'd given him hints that she was open to his advances. She genuinely enjoyed his company. He was everything she'd ever looked for in a husband, intelligent and honorable. She still didn't know how he would react, knowing who she'd almost given herself to. Now, you've done everything you can do to remain hidden. Sarah pulled her close and squeezed her arm, ducking closer as a swarm of people flowed around them. Let's enjoy ourselves. They were soon lost in the lively commotion and brash sounds of the traveling show. Vendors at tents and booths sold all sorts of merchandise and miracle medicines, some of which Margaret was sure Dr. Weston wouldn't approve of. Large posters advertised the numerous wonders they could see. At the very end of the fairway, a bit of flat ground had been set up for demonstrations by sharpshooters and trick riders. Margaret and Sarah stood at the edge with the other spectators, watching as both women and men showed off their skills. It is remarkable, isn't it? Sarah said as the show was wrapping up. It's no wonder my students were more excited about this than in doing arithmetic or practicing their penmanship. Ladies and gentlemen, the barker cried out from the small crate on which he stood. We'll be passing the hat for your generous donations to assist us as we continue to travel eastward, bringing the grand entertainment and extraordinary talents you have just seen. We do hope that the lovely town of Grand Ridge will so kindly host us once again when we travel back this way. A man who had only recently been showing off his expertise in rope tricks was now making his way along the row of spectators, holding out his hat. "Come now, spare a penny for a lowly traveler, ladies." He grinned unrepentantly at them, shooting a cocky wink at Sarah. "I bet you say that to all the girls." He leaned closer, eyes sparkling. "Just the pretty ones." Sarah barked out a laugh. "Every port, every town, no doubt." "Don't be like that," he crooned. "What's your name?" "Sarah Philpott." "Well, I'm mighty pleased to make your acquaintance, Miss Philpott." He turned to look at Margaret. "What's two beautiful gals like you two doing unaccompanied?" "Prosody. We're each other's company today, though this one is spoken for," Sarah added, clearly enjoying herself. "What should I call you?" He thrust his tumbling black hair out of his eyes. "Darlin', you can call me just about anything you like. Let me take you dancing tonight. You can pick out a name for me." Sarah dropped a silver coin into the upturned cap, eyeing him playfully. "You're trouble. You're breaking my heart here, sugar." He pressed a hand to his chest and stumbled back. "Come on, make me happy. Let me take you dancing. I can move really well for a pilgrim." Sarah shook her head. "Your type would play to the gallery all the livelong day. You're too flirty for my blood, sir." He held her look and then asked Margaret, "Is she always like this?" "Sarah is always just the way she needs to be," Margaret said as she pulled out her purse. "Now, there's an accent I recognize," he said with a grin. "It's not very often that I find a fellow New Englander out here in the West. You must be a Rockefeller or a DuPont." Margaret laughed at the comparison as she dug down into the bottom of her purse, sure that she had a coin or two stashed away. "No, I'm afraid the Bennetts never made it quite that far. And yet you made it all the way out here, and that's something." He nodded his thanks as she dropped a coin into his hat. "Bless you, Miss Bennett. You're very kind. And if you change your mind, Miss Philpott, I'll be at the tavern until the morning." They watched him swagger off before they collapsed into fits of giggles. Slowly, they began making their way back towards Sarah's cottage. "My goodness," Sarah gushed as they walked back into town. "That was something, wasn't it? I've never been to such an extravaganza. I wish Dalton had come along now." "Why didn't he?" "I didn't ask him, if I'm honest. It didn't seem like something he'd like." He'd been up and gone at first light the same as he was most days. She'd risen and made baked fresh muffins just as the sun was cresting the mountains, yet his boots were already gone. Sarah looked back, though they could no longer see the fair from this far away. "Are you missing your new friend already?" Sarah giggled. "He was handsome, I cannot deny, but I need steady and dependable like your Dalton." It was a strange sensation to think of a man as hers. Suddenly, she wanted to get back to him, to the ranch house. The past few weeks had been wonderful since she felt as if he was trying to get closer to her. The more she found out about him, the more she loved him. At the same time, the deeper her worry grew that he would cast her aside if he found out that she was keeping such an explosive secret. "I best get back, really. Ernestine is still getting over this fever. I ought to help her with supper. You should try her with that tea I mentioned. A few cups of it, and I guarantee she'll be right as rain. Let's stop by the store on the way past. Maybe I'll get her something else to cheer her up." Arm in arm, they headed down Main Street. Chapter 7. "Dalton, just take a look at this." "You seem to be feeling much better," Dalton noted as Mother rushed up to him. The head cold she'd been suffering from wasn't terrible, and he'd heard there were several other folks around who'd had something similar, but she wasn't getting any younger. "I suppose your tea worked?" "That, as well as this nice little gift from Margaret and Sarah." She held up a brand new teacup with a pink flower painted on the side. "They said it reminded them of the flower I wear in my bonnet, and they even filled it up with little hard candies. Wasn't that so sweet and generous of them?" Dalton frowned as he sat down to take off his boots before he tracked in mud from the soggy pastures. "She went into town again?" "Yes. She and Sarah went to see the traveling show. I was tempted to go see it myself. It's been a long time since I've done anything like that, but I knew I'd only make my condition worse. You could have gone, you know. It might have done you some good," Mother encouraged. "How is that?" Dalton set his boots neatly by the door. Ernestine put her fisted hands on her hips. You should be courting the girl. Isn't that why you did this ridiculous thing of putting her off for the second time? He didn't bother to hide his exasperated sigh. I already told you, Ma. Stay out of it. Ernestine flapped her hands by her head and banged a few of the cupboard doors for good measure. Honestly, I don't think you have half the sense you were born with. The girl is a godsend to this place. She's baking and cleaning. She's doing her best to learn her way around our household and to show that she can be a good wife. Dalton hung up his coat, trying not to react to his mother's needling words. She is nothing like that flighty mess that came here from Maryland. I know that broke your heart, son, but you cannot tarnish all women with the same brush. You're not being fair to the girl. Dalton crossed to the stove, lifted the black pan lid, and sniffed appreciatively. Rabbit stew? Ernestine's brows climbed her head, and he felt the child in him want to duck under that matronly glare. You are trying my patience, boy. I'm not trying to, Ma. It's just, how could he explain something that was just a gut instinct? Dalton had seen plenty of admirable qualities in Margaret, but it had been impossible for him to ignore the one that stood out the most. There was a part of Margaret that wasn't here in Colorado. I have to do things my way. She says you're worried that she's going to jump on a train and vanish. Is that what the problem is? He balked at the thought that his mother had had such a conversation with Margaret. But then what else were they meant to talk about when they spent all day together? No. Ernestine was feeling better. She was like a terrier when the mood took her. Because she's made a new friend in that nice new school teacher. That doesn't strike me as someone who is planning on leaving as soon as she can. And we don't have 2 cents to rub together, so she can't run off with the family gold now, can she? I understand why you see it that way, Dalton replied slowly, trying to figure out how he could explain this to her. She was excited about a wedding, of course, and he knew that the excitement of potential grandchildren was overriding everything else. He paced to the window, gazing out across the yard, the familiar lines of the peaks that protruded beyond his pastures. But think about how many times she's running off to town or going on long walks with Sarah. She gets a newspaper as soon as they arrive at the inn, and she reads through it like her life depends on it. Prosody. I've seen that distant look in her eyes, like she's waiting for something else to come along. I don't think she wants to be here, Ma. I can't explain it any other way. And have you asked her about it? Ernestine demanded. I know she's much younger than you, but she seems like a very mature young lady. I haven't, he admitted begrudgingly. Not as a direct question. Ernestine rolled her eyes at him. Give me strength. Go. Ask her. Do it now. She won't admit anything. I know she's hiding something. I just don't know what. His mother scowled at him. She could be irritated with him if she wanted to, but it had been a long time since she'd married his father. The two of them had known right away that they'd make a good match, and Dalton couldn't expect her to understand. Ma, I take marriage very seriously. I want to have a marriage the same as you did with my father. Though I might have placed an advertisement to find a wife, I still want to be sure that we're doing the right thing. Where is she, anyway? In the dining room, laying out the table. Supper is almost ready. He made his way into the dining room, pausing in the doorway as he saw Margaret carefully laying out the place settings. She paused to make sure the forks and spoons were the same distance from the edge of the table, a detail that would likely be lost on anyone else. She was graceful even as she performed such a menial task, absently lifting her skirt as she stepped around the corner of the table, much as a lady would. Her red hair was twisted up into an intricate knot that looked as if it had been weaved into place. Where had she learned to do that? As a maid? He surmised it was possible. He wasn't sure if he preferred her hair up that way, coiffed fashionably, or when she wore it braided down her back when they went out riding. He steered his thoughts away from how it would feel to thread his fingers through the copper tresses and deliberately scraped his boot along the floor to announce his presence. She was flighty despite what his mother claimed. She was easily scared, and she was always wary, no matter her surroundings. Margaret glanced up quickly and pressed her hand to her throat, though her smile was quick, genuine. Good evening. How was your day? Fine. He noted the table looked as grand as any he'd seen in the papers. Are we expecting guests? Ernestine was feeling better today when I was out. She said that these belonged to your grandparents. She indicated the silver candlesticks. You brought her favorite tea. He stepped further in. That was kind of you. It was the least I could do, seeing as I was in town. She cast an eye over her work, straightened a knife unnecessarily. I like her a lot. She's been teaching me her favorite recipes so that I can prepare them for you, for the ranch hands, whenever they start. She has some wonderful stories, some scary ones too, about how your parents arrived here. Margaret smiled and shook her head as she fiddled with the final place setting. I told her not to worry about supper when I left this morning, that I'd take care of it myself. She insisted, though. Some of that is probably because she's feeling better, and some of it is probably self-preservation. She's a much more accomplished cook than I. She's had quite a few years of experience. Dalton followed her around the table. Where did you learn to set the table like this? Home, she murmured with a contemplative smile. She looked up quickly. That is, home where I worked as a maid, he nodded, torn between wanting to shake the truth out of her and kissing her until he forgot the reasons that he was hesitating to marry her in the first place. She clouded his thoughts, and he could barely think straight. He narrowed his eyes, cleared his throat. Ma says the fair was in town. Yes, I went with Sarah. I've never seen such a thing. They don't have traveling fairs in Boston. She frowned at him then, wariness sliding into her eyes. I'm sure they do, but I never went to one. Because you were a maid. She tipped her head, folded her arms as she continued to watch him. Is there something you want to say to me? Because if there is, just come right out and say it. Supper's ready, his mother announced, backing through the door and swinging around, crock-pot held aloft. Golly, this looks divine, Margaret. I bet your employers were kicking themselves when you left your position in Boston. He took his seat at the head of the table as the conversation of her previous life flowed. It sounded genuine enough. Maybe his mother was right. His reluctance to commit was a fallout from the Maryland debacle. This indecision was further proof that his head and his heart were conflicted. Margaret was young, beautiful, and graceful. She'd been ready enough to defend herself when she'd challenged him. She had grit and a backbone. She'd found a good friend in Sarah, and he'd noted that the rest of the town seemed to be opening up to her. And yet, he still couldn't quite be sure. Chapter 8. Dalton? Haven't we ridden off of your land by now? With a gentle tug of the reins, she brought the buckskin pony that Dalton had saddled up for her to a halt at the top of a hill and looked around. Just as Ernestine had promised her, it looked as though God had used his paintbrush to dapple the land with every color imaginable. Before her, the land rolled away, undulating in gentle hills. Blooms popped and leaves unfurled, casting off the last vestiges of winter. The views were simply breathtaking. It was a sight she'd never even imagined, and now she was right in the middle of it. Dalton laughed. I'm afraid not. My original claim was quite a bit smaller than this, but working this land isn't for everyone. Some of my neighbors wanted to sell out, and they were kind enough to give me a chance at it. Ranching will teach you to be very careful with your resources because you never know when you're going to need them. Fortunately, I had enough money that I was able to increase my acreage as well as my herd. She smiled at him. With his eyes narrowed against the dazzling sunlight, she admitted his profile. He rode as fluidly as he moved, as if he had been born in the saddle. Ernestine had mentioned that his mood would get lighter once the weather warmed, and she had been right. She had made more of an effort to be genuine with him, skirting the truth, using Camilla's stories as her own when talking about working in a big house. She'd portrayed her parents as her employers. That way, it was easier to keep the lies she weaved straight in her head. Oftentimes, she forgot that she was meant to be in hiding. The longer time she spent with Dalton, the easier it became to live her truth. There was a sparkle behind those deep green eyes that matched the fresh growth on the pine trees. You're quite the businessman, aren't you? He shook his head, and a tinge of pink came into his cheeks. I never really tend to think about it that way, but I suppose you're right. I think a lot of folks come out to places like this. They tell themselves that it's because it's a chance to strike it rich or own far more land than they could ever afford back east. They forget it's also about setting down roots, a legacy for future generations. For me, it was more about making my life into what I wanted it to be. Did you choose to settle here for a reason? He urged his horse on, and she allowed her pony to amble alongside his big stallion. They'd taken to riding out most days as the winter thawed, though she knew the time was coming when he wouldn't have time for such frivolities, and she would miss it. It was a pin in the map. Mother moved in after my father passed on. She sold their lands, which then allowed me to buy that parcel of land you see beyond that grove of trees. Better grazing? Surprised, he looked at her. Maybe you'll make a rancher yet. She laughed, enjoying his company, the easy charm, the gentle conversation. Everything around him was simple, but she knew his mind to be as sharp as a steel trap. He didn't miss a thing. I dare say it's a lot more than riding around and admiring the lands, she said. And then some. It certainly isn't for the money, he said with a laugh. Not that I'm poor, of course, but you're right, the work is very hard. Are you worried I'm not up to the task? She teased him, drawing a glance from him. When he looked at her a second time, she grinned. My mother already claims you've been sent from heaven, and you can do no wrong in her eyes. Margaret tried not to let his words dim her bubble of joy. The longer she'd waited to marry him, the worse she felt for lying to both Dalton and Ernestine. She'd had to keep in mind that it was for their own good. But she'd been here in Grand Ridge for more than 2 months, with no signs of Edward. She'd talk it through with Sarah when the right time might be to let her parents know where she was. She dearly longed for news from back home. Are you getting tired? We can turn back for the ranch if you'd rather. She lifted her head, gave it a little shake. I'm just fine and dandy, thank you. You'll let me know? Indeed, I will, she replied, touched by his concern for her comfort as she followed his horse along the path carved through the land. They rode down into the valley, rolling hills carpeted with wildflowers that rose to meet the forest. A creek flowed through the center of it, gushing musically with snowmelt, the riverbank lined with budding willows and cottonwoods. Deep purple lupines waved lazily in the breeze, and the bright sunshine warmed her shoulders. A small herd of deer appeared at the edge of the forest, only to vanish once more as the horses met the flatter ground. We can take a break here, Dalton suggested as he swung down out of the saddle. We'll let the horses drink, and we have a bit of food. He came around and held out his hand. She slid to the ground in front of him, finding that she didn't mind his hands around her waist to steady her. Margaret had spent plenty of her life on horseback, and she didn't need the assistance for that reason, but simply being around Dalton was starting to make her a bit dizzy. You brought food? Ma put it together after I said we were riding out to the far pastures. That was nice of her. He pulled a few wrapped packets and a jug from his saddlebag. The creek is the most important factor to the operation here. It flows down through much of the property, and it feeds the pond down closer to the house. It waters the cattle and the surrounding grasses. Can you fish in it? He shook out the blanket, a smile playing with the edges of his mouth. Trout, mostly. Do you fish? She'd been admiring the playful splash of the water as he spoke and turned to him with a smile. No, but I'd like to try it. Coming here was a way of starting again, of finding something new, far away from a life that I know now that I didn't much care for. I want to try everything that these lands have to offer. He paused in peeling back the muslin wrap as a strange look crossed his face. Do you mean that? Of course. I want to build a life here, with you. Maggie, he breathed, his gaze roving her face. She wet her lips with her tongue, her throat suddenly dry. Her skin tingled with awareness. Nobody has ever shortened my name before, she replied hoarsely. Would you rather I not? He asked quickly. I just thought it suited you. No, I like it. She took a step closer to him. I think I could be a Maggie, a new person for a new start out here with you. The package dropped to the ground unheeded as he closed the distance between them. He cupped her face gently, green eyes meeting her. Her heart clattered in her chest, blood roaring as their bodies aligned. He whispered her name again, thumbing her bottom lip before gently, softly, sweetly, he laid his mouth on hers. Sensation exploded as her eyes drifted closed. She'd been kissed before. It had always been chaste. Edward had grabbed, branded, almost to the point of pain. This was different. It was a connection, as if her lips had been made to fit with his. He raised his head, eyes flaring with fervor. She nodded, rolling her lips inward to capture, to savor, the deliciousness of his touch. "I've been wanting to do that since the moment we met," he whispered as his hands lowered. She wanted to grab them, to place them back, to keep their joining for just a little while longer. "Was it all you'd hoped?" "More," he said ruefully. They looked at each other a moment longer. Of all the places she'd been, Margaret didn't want to be anywhere else other than with him. "We'd better eat what Ma packed," he said, bending to flick out the corner of the blanket that had been disturbed by their feet. "Else she'll tan my hide for starving her favorite girl." Margaret sat on the blanket. "I'm her favorite?" Dalton lowered himself beside her, dealt with the waxed paper, and handed her meat and cheese sandwiched between a biscuit. "Of course, you're everyone's favorite by all accounts. I'm getting reports from the folks in town about how lovely you are. When I was in town last week to place the advert for cowhands, Mr. Ragsdale said you've charmed the town in record time." "I've just been myself," Margaret admitted. "I dare say meeting Sarah helped no end." She adjusted her skirt around her and looked out at the fields, at the sunlight sparkling over the rushing water. This was a very different place, yes, but it felt like home. Margaret had escaped her old life without too much care about any consequences as long as she got away from Edward. Here in Grand Ridge, she truly had a new start. Nobody knew anything more than she wanted to tell them. It was easy to leave out the more unpleasant memories here, to simply be herself instead of being the daughter of a wealthy businessman with a hefty dowry. She realized now she'd always had to try and fit into a mold: the perfect daughter, the dutiful friend, the polite society girl. All roles that hadn't appealed to her, well, apart from being a good daughter. Her parents had always done right by her, and they deserved to know the truth. One day, she hoped to be able to tell them. Dalton reached out, rubbing the copper curl that fell over her ear. "What are you thinking about when the clouds come into your eyes?" she sighed. Briefly met his searching gaze, then focused on pulling the last of her sandwich to pieces. She longed to be able to reveal everything, but it had taken him this long to trust her, to spend the time getting to know her. It would surely all be taken away from her. She couldn't risk this precarious happiness tumbling away like the creek water. "My parents," she admitted. "I miss them." "When did they pass?" Her gut clenched. Of course, Camilla's parents had died when she was young. She ought to let him go, to tell him the truth. He was a simple rancher, but Margaret was beginning to see that he was so much more. Just like her parents, he'd been tangled in this complicated web of lies she'd spun. Tears sprang forth, spilling over her lids and tracking down her cheeks. "Oh, darlin'," he crooned, gathering her close. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have brought up such a painful subject. Come on now." "It's not that," she sniffed, leaning into his touch. "It's just, everything is such a mess." Guilt over having misrepresented herself to him pricked at her conscience. She'd chosen him in the way he had this place, by picking his advert out of the 30 that were on the page. She knew that no other man would have affected her quite the way he did. She didn't want to hurt him, but by staying here, by staying quiet, she had done that already. How could she ever hope to dig herself out of this mess and have him love her anyway? "Shh," he patted her awkwardly. "Look, why don't I tell you the real reason I brought you to this valley? To show me the creek?" His husky laughter rumbled under her ear. "Yes, well, that too. I want you to be my wife." Maggie sat bolt upright, tears stalling, confession forgotten, heart crashing about in her chest. "But you said it's only been a month since you said you wanted to wait." His lopsided grin echoed her own. "I know what I said, but I don't want to wait. I spoke to the preacher last week. It's all arranged for Saturday." She blinked. This weekend?" His eyes searched hers, brushing the curl back over her shoulder. "What is it? Have you changed your mind?" "I've made you wait too long." Is that it? You don't want to marry me now? Fresh tears chased down her cheeks. I do want to be your wife, Dalton, more than anything in the world, but… No buts, he grinned at her, relief shuddering through his body. Come on, help me pack this away. Ma will be thrilled to pieces. Dalton clambered to his feet, nudging her back off the blanket and rolling it all away. She'd come here to marry a man so that Edward wouldn't be able to claim her for himself, to make a life for herself on a new horizon. She'd done all that. So why did she feel as though she'd slid down a dark rabbit hole that had no way out of? Chapter 9. There. All the buttons are done up. Now, do you want your skirt bustled? Sarah fussed around behind her with the tape sewn onto the underside of the material. We should at least bustle it for the trip into town, and then we can let it down at the church if you'd like. Margaret looked at herself in the mirror. The striped silk and deep apricot had been an indulgence when she'd packed what little she could take with her. It wasn't nearly as practical as some of the other dresses, and it could not be altered into one more practical. Margaret had worn these clothes many times before, and she'd never considered the outfit to be one luxurious enough to get married in. Here on the ranch, though, the material had been too dainty for her daily work. She'd set it aside for this occasion specifically. She'd put it on in a cloud of uncertainty. She'd woken up the day after Dalton had announced that he'd spoken with the preacher with a tight ball of dread in her stomach. She'd gone from pretending to be the polite society girl to pretending to be a blushing bride. She knew that she had to tell him the truth. She didn't want to start her married life on a lie. But ever since they'd emerged out of the valley after Dalton's proposal, it seemed that the work around the ranch had gained momentum. He worked long hours, which meant that she hadn't once had the chance to speak to him, to let him know her true self. Now that her wedding day was finally here, the dress felt constrictive. That would be just fine. Are you all right? Sarah asked. You seem a little distant. I'm just happy. Margaret smiled, and her reflections smiled back at her. Sarah cupped her hands around her upper arms and looked directly into her eyes. Maggie, it's going to be fine. You know that, right? I should tell him, she whispered. Sarah rolled her eyes. I thought you'd settled on telling him. I don't know, on your deathbed. What good will telling him now do? It will make me feel better, and hurt him in the process. Margaret lifted eyes of misery to her friend. But at least he would know. What then? You'd have to leave this town. Start again. Find someone else to marry you. That takes time. The whole point of starting a new life was to escape. Marriage protects you from anything that this Edward character can say or do. Margaret nodded. I know. Then let's get you to the church. Sarah took one last look at her and adjusted a strand of Margaret's hair. They struck out along the street. They decided to get ready at Sarah's cottage. They turned onto the main thoroughfare to be met with a smattering of applause that grew the further they walked. I think you safely assume that you've been accepted in Grand Ridge, Sarah murmured, waving at the people who called out the well wishes. Looks like half the town. I'd say it's more than half, Sarah chuckled. The church was a gray clapboard dwelling set on a lot of land right in the center of the town. Ernestine waited for them at the front door, her staple pink bonnet flower joined with extra wildflowers to mark this happy day. She hugged Margaret warmly. You look absolutely lovely. Everyone is ready for you. Everyone? Margaret asked as Sarah pressed a bouquet of wildflowers into her hand. You're one of us now. Ernestine gestured to the crowded church. Every pew was full. There was Dr. and Mrs. Weston. The blacksmith had finally stopped his hammering long enough, and he'd brought his wife as well. Even Sheriff Turner was there, his badge shining. All of their neighbors out near the ranch were in attendance, and the Ragsdales waved happily from the front. It all made her so happy, but then her eyes landed on the groom. Doubt was quashed by love. She loved this man. She couldn't imagine pledging her life to anyone but him. Dalton had put on his Sunday best and combed his hair carefully. He turned to her with joy in his eyes, and it was all she could do not to run down the aisle to him. Hello, Maggie, he said softly when she'd made her way to the front of the church and stood next to him. Hello. She returned with a smile. Father Clark leaned forward, voice low. Ready?" She let out a shaky breath, telling herself that she would find the right time. Just not today. She nodded, swallowing nervously as she met Dalton's loving gaze. It didn't matter that it wasn't a grand society affair, that her parents didn't know that she was joining her life to a man they'd never met. "Today, we thank the Lord for showing us love," Father Clark intoned, his voice carrying above the shuffling and the murmurs. "For bringing us all together in his name, and for gifting us a love that we can all celebrate. Love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is—" The front door of the church slammed open. Startled, Margaret turned with the others. She squinted at the silhouette illuminated in the brilliant sunlight that fanned out behind him. For a second, she wondered if she was dreaming. But the silhouette moved, morphed. She instantly recognized those hard eyes and the callous smile. Her heart dropped down to her feet. Icy fear coursed through her. Not a dream, a nightmare, and it was unfolding right in front of her. "Maggie?" Dalton asked softly, and it was then that she realized just how hard she was squeezing his hand, that the whimpering sound she could hear in the silent church was coming from her. "What is it?" She was too late. The past had caught up with her. Chapter 10. Edward pointed his finger at her. "Margaret Bennett, I've found you." Dalton quickly drew her behind him. "Who are you? And just what do you think you're doing interrupting my wedding?" "I'm merely saving you a lot of trouble," he replied with a cold laugh. "My name is Edward Rowland. I'm here to claim what is rightfully mine. Hand her over and I'll be on my merry way back to Boston." "What are you talking about?" Dalton turned to glance at Margaret. "Do you know this man?" The bark of laughter was like a dagger to her. Memories of that night washed over her, of how he'd laughed whilst the man lay bleeding at his feet. Fear had closed off her throat. She looked imploringly at Dalton, pleading silently for help. "Of course she does," Edward said. He came down the aisle, ever closer. "She knows me quite well, and I know her." Edward sauntered down the middle of the room, enjoying the attention that his performance drew. "I'm afraid you've all been taken in by a liar and a trickster. Why don't you come quietly, Margaret? Leave these nice folks in peace." "Maggie?" She heard the sting of betrayal in his voice, and the warmth that had been in his eyes only a moment ago was now gone. "Who is he?" "Edward, don't do this," Margaret pleaded, her voice thick, rusty with emotion. Her tongue was heavy in her mouth, making it difficult to speak. Dalton snatched his hand back, staring at her as if she was a stranger. "Maggie, tell me what's going on." "Who's Maggie?" Edward sniggered. He took off his hat just long enough to slick back his dark hair. "This is Margaret Bennett, heir to the Bennett fortune, darling of Boston's elite. She's also my fiancée." The murmuring of the congregation grew. Dalton looked at her, pain behind his eyes. "You never said anything about being engaged before." Edward's laugh echoed in the church, lifting above the growing noise. "My good man, I'd be willing to bet that there's plenty she didn't tell you." "Edward, stop, please, not like this." "Stop what, Margaret? Telling the truth about how you're a runaway bride? About how you reneged on a promise after confessing undying love for me?" She rounded on her past, anger burning through the confusion and shame. "I did no such thing." "Of course you did. Don't these good people deserve to know the truth about you? That you disappeared from Boston when you'd already made a promise to me? And just look at you, wearing that old rag. You should have sent it off to the poorhouse a long time ago. Lord knows you can afford something far better. Why, I'd say the ball gown you wore at Christmas time cost more than what the people here make in 6 months." "I never loved you," Margaret stated, holding on to the anger. She glanced at Dalton, "At least not in the way I now know what love is." Edward opened his mouth, exaggerating his shock, clapped his hands to his face. "You love him? Well, shoot, why didn't you say that? I guess I ought to believe you now." He came to a halt a few feet away from her, his face distorted into the grotesque mask of disdain. "I tracked you halfway across this country to bring you back to your rightful place." "My place is here," Margaret said. "No, it ain't." Her face heated and her bones shook. She'd tried so hard to get away from him. She thought for sure that if she just put enough distance between herself and everything back home, it would simply fade away. There hadn't been any way of dealing with Edward face to face, and so she'd run. But he'd caught up with her now. "How did you find me?" she demanded. "Oh, it wasn't all that hard," Edward spat. Teps plent. "I'm a smart man, and I have plenty of resources at my disposal. First of all, I didn't fall for that bit your parents gave me about you visiting your cousin in New York." Margaret glanced at Dalton, who was gazing at her. She held his gaze as Edward continued talking. "No, Margaret, you're a clever girl, and I've always admired that about you, but that wasn't much of an excuse at all. You wouldn't simply have skipped town for a friendly visit without telling me now, would you? It didn't take much digging to work out that you don't have any cousins." She ground her teeth together, angry at herself for seeing that small part of the puzzle. He was right. No woman would do such a thing without informing her fiancé, because that was only the polite thing to do. She hadn't bought herself any time with that charade at all. So, then it was a simple matter of interviewing everyone and anyone who knew you. Someone had to know where you'd gone, and I couldn't simply let my future wife disappear. That wouldn't make me a very responsible fiancé now, would it? Edward tented his fingers over his chest and gave the guests an appealing look. "Though I hate to admit it, finding you was a bit of a stroke of luck when one of my boys was at a card game. Happened upon a man who worked with a traveling fair at the same table." Horror washed over her. Her eyes slid to Sarah, who was shaking her head. The man at the traveling show, the one who recognized her accent. Her flowers slipped from her hand. She'd been so foolish. Margaret hadn't officially introduced herself, but she didn't have to since she'd given up her surname. You see, people will give up all sorts of information when you line their pockets, including whether or not they'd spoken to any well-bred young ladies from the Boston area during their travels. They can be coerced into anything, but you know that, Margaret. After all, you found this poor sap who was fool enough to agree to marry you. Edward flicked a gloved hand in Dalton's direction. Dalton moved toward him, towering over the other man by half a head. "Listen up and listen well. I don't know who you are, and I don't know if all the things you're saying are true. Even if they are, this is hardly the time or the place. If you want to talk, then we can talk, but you've got no business coming in here like this." "I will leave, with what I came here for," he rounded on Margaret, reaching for her. "You'd better get your backside back through those doors, or so help me." "Not in here!" Father Clark's finger shot upwards. "You will not use the Lord's name in vain. Sonny, I don't know who you are or which cloud of dust you blew in with, but you watch your mouth in my church." "That's right," Ernestina piped up from her seat next to Mrs. Ragsdale. "Your mother should have taught you some better manners." Several of the other guests nodded in agreement. Edward sneered at the older woman, but he wasn't done embarrassing Margaret yet. "You only think so because you don't understand the truth of the matter at hand. This young woman has misrepresented herself. She's not free to wed, and she's lived a life far different from anything that she's told you. I don't suppose she regaled you with the story of how she insisted on taking the sleigh out during the worst blizzard we'd had in decades, even at the potential peril of herself and her friends, and without even a gentleman to escort them in case of disaster? I highly doubt she told you about the time she poured her drink right over the head of a local and prestigious congressman." "Stop that," Margaret snapped, anger starting to take over her fear. She balled her hands into fists. "He deserved it. And that has absolutely nothing to do with why you're here ruining my wedding." Ah, there she is. Edward's grin told her that she'd just given him exactly what he'd wanted, even if she hadn't meant to. "There's the wildcat I know from back home, the one who likes adventure so much. Tell me, Margaret, is that what all of this was for you? Was he just a little bit of adventure you needed to have before you came back home to marry me? I can forgive you for it, I suppose. In time. All you need to do right now is come with me. We'll take the first train back to Boston." He held out his hand. Margaret slapped it away, causing a few gasps in the pews. "Absolutely not." The mock smile on Edward's face fell quickly away, and she saw the threat in his eyes. "I'm being very generous here, Margaret. I suggest you take advantage of it before I change my mind." You're appalling, Edward. Margaret lifted her chin. She'd been happy to become Maggie, a simple woman who wanted to make friends and enjoy the lovely little town she lived in. Right now, though, she needed to be the bold socialite who wasn't afraid to say what was on her mind. I'm ashamed of myself for falling for your insipid charms. I don't know how I couldn't have seen through that slicked back hair and that ridiculous hat. You wear all your money on your sleeve, but you have no heart. What I have here with Dalton is the real thing, the sort of love you should have before you get married. Edward gave her a derisive snort. I've certainly known you to be a passionate woman, Margaret, but not a sentimental one. You've simply become a bit nervous about our engagement. It's only reasonable, considering I'm one of the wealthiest eligible men in Boston. Any woman would be a bit anxious, knowing she'd be the envy of every woman. I'm sure plenty of pearls and diamonds can make you feel more at ease. Come now, I'd like to get back to civilization as soon as possible. Promises dripped from his mouth, but Margaret knew he didn't mean any of it. He only wanted her under his control because she knew his real secret. If she went back to Boston with him, she'd be under his watchful eye for the rest of her life. The moment he felt she stepped out of line, Margaret had no doubt something terrible would happen to her. Fear had made her run, but now there was no place left to go. Margaret had found a life she wanted, a new place in the world that truly suited her, but it was slipping out of her hands by the minute. She couldn't leave the past behind, though she'd tried. She had to confront it now if she was ever to have a chance at her future. Do you want to know the real reason that I left, Edward? I'll tell you, and I'll tell anyone else who's willing to listen. I'm not afraid anymore. The entirety of the church held its breath. She straightened her shoulders and kept her head high. It was her truth, and it was the truth. Margaret should have spoken it a long time ago. I left Boston because I could not live with, and I could certainly never love, a murderer. Chapter 11. Dalton looked back and forth between the woman who'd been about to become his wife and the man who insisted she already belonged to him. Anger, confusion, and frustration all boiled inside of him. He'd been in pure bliss this morning, delighted to be marrying such a wonderful woman. She loved the ranch and the town, and he knew that she loved him too. She even loved his mother, and they were destined to have a happy household. This stranger was changing all of that, and very quickly. He'd revealed much about Margaret that she hadn't yet told him. Worse still, she hadn't denied any of it, except that part that she'd loved him. She was engaged. She wasn't a maid, but a wealthy socialite. Dalton watched the storm behind her eyes, his mind racing as this Bostonian waxed lyrical about who she was. She wasn't the person he thought he was marrying at all. That was hard enough, but her last sentence still hung heavy in the air. That's right, Margaret asserted, once the shocked silence in the church turned to urgent murmurings. This man is a murderer. Sheriff Turner, you should contact the police in Boston, because I think they'd be very interested to hear what I have to say. The Rowland family is very wealthy and influential. That's true, and it's also true that much of the rest of Boston society was fooled into believing that it was simply because they were very smart at what they did. I know the truth, though. Edward, you make your money by lying to people, promising them one thing and then giving them another. When they try to stand up for themselves, you make them pay the price. Sometimes that's with money, and other times that's with their lives. Edward's ridiculous laugh once again filled the church. You see, people? She's in hysterics. She needs an asylum, not a church. I was there. Margaret's voice grew stronger. It was at the Kennedys' house party last fall. Dalton noticed how the man stilled. Something dark and sinister moved in his eyes, even as he dismissed her words. She pressed on regardless. I came to look for you. I heard your laughter, loud and clear, coming from the arboretum. Absurd claims, Edward scoffed, speaking to the crowd at large. The poor woman might have been born into money, but she just doesn't understand how business works. She's only a woman after all, and I really can't hold that against her. Now Dalton was starting to see a bit more of the picture. Margaret hadn't been honest with him about her past, but this man didn't know her as well as he thought she did. Dalton knew she was no simpleton. I understand a lot more than you think, Margaret asserted. Even if I didn't, It doesn't take a lot of brains to comprehend what I saw. You murdered that man. He crossed you by refusing to sell his family's business to you, one that had been in operation for generations. It was just my bad luck that you happened to run across him while I was with you. Perhaps I should say it was my good fortune, because otherwise I might never have known until it was too late for me. Does it matter? It's not as though your new beau is going to marry you now, not knowing what he does. That's enough from you. Dalton once again inserted himself between Margaret and Edward. He was furious that he'd been made a fool in front of the entire town, and he certainly had a lot of questions for his betrothed, but he couldn't accept another second of this. You've given me good reason to doubt everything you've said here today, and whether or not I marry Margaret has nothing to do with you. My good man, I know precisely how to change your mind. I'll do you a grand favor. I'll take this awful woman off your hands, and I'll leave you with a tidy sum for your trouble. It's the least I can do to account for all of your time that she's wasted. Edward reached into his inside jacket pocket. You can keep your money, Dalton growled. But when Edward withdrew his hand, he wasn't holding his wallet. His fist crashed into Dalton's nose. Dalton stumbled backward, caught off guard by the sudden attack. Stars burst in his vision, surrounded by blackness. His body threatened to give up. The punch had been a hard and direct slam, but he couldn't lose consciousness now. He had to be there for Margaret, for his Maggie. Easy there, Dr. Weston said as his hands pressed into Dalton's shoulders and kept him upright. I'm okay, Doc. Dalton wiped the smear of blood from his nose, spoiling his best suit. As his vision returned, he focused on Edward. He knew that the other man deserved a good punch in return, and maybe a few extra for good measure, but he didn't want to stoop to Edward's level. I'm going to give you 10 seconds to get out of this church. More than enough time, Edward retorted. He whipped out his arm and clamped his hand around Margaret's arm, his fingers pinching the material of her dress. I've got what I need, so I'm glad to go. Margaret let out a scream of anger and fear. Dalton charged forward, shoving his sleeves up his arm, but a flash of metal stopped him. Edward had produced a tiny pistol from his pocket, and he now held the muzzle under Margaret's chin. Stop right there, cowboy, Edward commanded. If you take one more step, I'm pulling the trigger. It was his wedding day, and so it was the one day that Dalton hadn't strapped his pistol to his hip. There had to be something he could do. He couldn't let this man take Margaret away from him. Dalton had never imagined he'd find a woman like her. He couldn't lose her now. There had to be a way to get her back. You're not going anywhere. Sheriff Turner was standing in the aisle, his hand hovering over his six-shooter. Edward snarled at him. Do you really think one man is going to stop me? He's not exactly alone. The blacksmith stood up behind him, folding his arms in front of his wide chest. Not at all. Mr. Ragsdale joined him, flicking his jacket back and unclipping his holster. I'm sure not letting you take my friend anywhere, Sarah decried, popping up in the front row. Nope, Ernestina confirmed. That girl isn't going anywhere. She doesn't want to, and certainly not with the likes of you. Before Dalton knew it, the whole gathering was on their feet. They blocked the aisle and the doors, and they moved further toward the altar to make sure that Edward was surrounded. The man had killed before, according to Margaret. Dalton didn't doubt that it was true, not given the hard glare in his eyes. But that was back in his home territory, where he was surrounded by people who feared him. Would he do the same out here? Would he take Margaret away from him in any way that he could manage? What's the matter with you people? Edward growled. She's a liar, a trickster. She had you all fooled. Dalton took a step toward him, daring him to follow through on his earlier threat. He knew he had the whole town at his back now. I think you've got your answer. Fine, Edward thrust Margaret at Dalton. Maggie, Dalton caught her and held her close. I'll be back to collect what's mine, Edward declared. I won't go with you, Margaret called out. You have to sleep sometime, sweetheart, and I'm staying right here in Grand Ridge. I'll be waiting and watching. You're mine. No one leaves Edward Rowland. I'll get myself a room at the inn, and I can afford to stay as long as I'd like. No, sir, Mr. Ragsdale asserted, his wife right on his heels. You're not staying at my inn." "Are you a fool, old man?" Edward's face was twisted with rage. "I can pay you twice your regular rate." "Your money's no good here," Mr. Ragsdale replied confidently. "Not at my inn, and not anywhere else in Grand Ridge. We don't want you or your filthy money." Edward shoved his way back down the aisle of the church as the rest of the townsfolk called after him. "Get out of here! Don't come back! Get lost!" The sheriff went after him, but Dalton only had eyes for Margaret. "Are you all right? Did he hurt you?" He held her upright in his arms, checking her over. A bruise was already forming on her jaw, and Dalton aimed a dark look at the door. Roland was nowhere to be seen. "He's gone." He'd seen the harsh way that Edward had grasped her, and he knew Edward very well might have done worse if he thought he could get away with it. "The doctor is right here if you need him." "I'm fine," she assured him. Her eyes shimmered with tears. "At least I'm fine physically." He brought her to a pew, which was now nearly empty, while the rest of Grand Ridge was chattering about all that had just happened. The noise in the church was deafening, but it allowed them some privacy. He rubbed her arms, giving her a moment to gather herself. She hiccuped her way through several shuddering sobs. "I'm so sorry for bringing this trouble to your door." Dalton searched her face. "I knew that you were hiding something, but I had no idea it was this." "How could you?" she sniffed. "I misjudged a man completely. I was a fool. I tried to walk away from him, but he wouldn't allow it. My only option was to marry another." "So that's all this was? A way out?" Margaret looked about her at the congregation. Some watched them, others were engrossed in chatter. "You want me to tell you here?" "I think I deserve the truth, Maggie." She nodded. "I love you, Dalton, more than I ever dreamed was possible to love another. But yes, I came here to escape. I wasn't expecting you. Never you." He listened, waiting for more. "For all of it. I didn't mean to lie to you. In the beginning, I was afraid of what Edward might do to me or my family if I told anyone. One white lie led to another lie, and it sort of grew from there. I tried to tell you the truth, but you seemed so hesitant to trust me, and I didn't want to risk hurting you or losing you." "You didn't trust me." She sagged into the seat, obviously exhausted after that ordeal. "I suppose I didn't. I was scared he'd track me down. I worried about what he was doing to my parents, who are alive and well, but don't know where I am." He let out a wry laugh. "That explains why you were always reading the paper, going into town, and looking behind you. I thought it was because you wanted to go home, but you were just trying to make sure that your past didn't come back to find you. I lied to protect my family and to save myself. In the process, I have lost the only man I've ever loved. You could have told me. It wouldn't have changed a thing between us." Her brows lifted, her gaze steady as she returned the dubious look. "Wouldn't it? Can you hand on heart say that?" His mouth bent. He acknowledged the comment with a twist of his head. "Perhaps not. I've not exactly shown much trust in you either. I should have told you everything about myself, the good, the bad, and otherwise. I know what you must think of me now that you've heard all of those things," Edward said. Dalton raised an eyebrow. Did the congressman deserve to have a drink dumped on him? A hint of a smile tugged at one corner of her mouth. "It was the mayor, and yes, he most certainly did." "Then I believe you. Not that awful man. I admit that I was a bit taken aback when he came in and revealed the part of yourself that you hadn't divulged to me yet. It made me wonder for a moment if I could trust you. But it became obvious pretty quickly that he was only trying to control you. That's not a relationship, and it's not a marriage. At least, it's not the sort of marriage that I want." He slipped his hand underneath hers. Dalton had come so close to losing her, and it had shaken him. That's all that Edward had ever been about, but I didn't realize it. I knew it was never really love. It was just how things happened. I was doing what everyone expected of me, even though I thought I was always upending the status quo. I've been such a fool, Dalton. "No," he patted her hand. "Don't talk like that." But it's true. Her blue eyes were full of sorrow as she looked up at him. "I made some terrible mistakes. I could forgive myself for that, except that I've made you, Ernestine, Sarah, and everyone else here a part of it. I never meant to hurt anyone. Really, I didn't. And I wasn't trying to misrepresent myself at all. What you've seen of me here is the real Maggie. I don't have anything that I need to fight against the way I did back home." "It's all right," he soothed. Dalton put his arm around her, wishing he could truly make her feel better. Edward was gone, and there was no chance he'd be staying in town, but she was still so tense. "I do wish that you'd told me, simply so that I might have had a chance to help you. But I understand, and I believe you. Thank you." She took a deep, shuddering breath. "That means a lot to me, Dalton. I know that you can't want to marry me now, but knowing that you feel that way does make it better." "Hold on a second." Dalton leaned back. "I never said I didn't want to marry you." She blinked. "I just assumed." "Maggie, my Maggie." He pulled her close again. "I know that we haven't started off the best way. I kept you at arm's distance. I'm sure that didn't make you feel any more comfortable about telling me the truth about your life in Boston, but now we've had it all come out. I know neither one of us can change what happened to us in the past, but we can shape our future. Together." "Oh, Dalton." She pressed her hands to his chest as she turned her body toward him, joy overtaking the sorry on her face. "Do you really mean that?" "I do." He stood, reaching out his hand and pulling her to her feet. "Many people in our situation get married the moment they meet each other, without any knowledge of what their pasts might be like, or how well they get along. I'd say that with everything we've been through, we're much better off than most. I'd love to marry you, Maggie, and have you as my wife. There's only one thing I'd like to ask of you." She stood in front of him, breathless, her eyes wide and shimmering. "What is it?" "Let's have no more secrets between us. If we're to be as one, then let's truly be as one. How does that sound?" To him, it sounded like everything he ever could have wanted, even if they'd gone the long way around to getting there. Margaret smiled broadly. "Perfect. It sounds perfect." "Well, now." Father Clark had appeared next to them. He clasped his hands in front of him as he beamed at each of them. "Did I hear correctly? Is there still a wedding happening today?" "Yes." Dalton and Margaret answered simultaneously. "Twice. Wonderful. Love has won at the end of the day. Ladies and gentlemen." The gathered audience still lingered, talking urgently to each other as they rehashed the excitement of Edward's appearance. "If everyone could have a seat, the wedding is still on." An exuberant cheer went up from the crowd, and Margaret and Dalton once again took their places in front of the altar. Dalton had paid attention to every word when they'd stood here just a short time ago, but now he was driven to distraction by the vision in front of him. He focused on the way Maggie's hands felt in his, and he traced every line of her face with his eyes. She was a vision, but it was her heart that had truly won him over. Chapter 12. "There now. That's perfect. And you said you didn't have any experience in the garden except for growing a few flowers." Ernestine scolded with a smile. Maggie, a name that she had fully accepted for herself now, and which she introduced herself as whenever she met someone new, beamed down at the neat rows of the freshly planted vegetable garden. At the moment, they looked like nothing but long lines of dark earth that had been churned up and patted back down again, but she knew the secret they held inside. She and Ernestine had planted carrots, cabbages, beans, and tomatoes. Soon enough, there would be a bountiful crop. Maggie hoped that her own body also held a secret, and that she and Dalton might soon be welcoming a child. "It's not as though I've done any of this on my own," Maggie reminded her. "You've been out here guiding me every step of the way. We've all got to learn somehow." Ernestine picked up the rake and shovel and carried it toward the barn. "I remember wondering how my parents could possibly remember all the things they knew about running a household out here. That was back in Wyoming, of course, but it's not so different here. At any rate, they always seem to know just when to plant and when to harvest, when to bring the cattle in and when to let them out to pasture." Maggie followed along behind her with the rest of the tools. She knew there was also the matter of all the cleaning and cooking to be done, not to mention various repairs to clothing and the buildings. "That's a lot to keep track of." "Yes," Ernestine said with a bob of her silvered bun. "The thing is, it doesn't feel like that much when you've got a good partner in life, when your husband cares just as much about being successful as you do. If you know that he's carrying his part of the load, then your own doesn't have to feel quite so heavy." Glancing up at the hills, where Dalton had gone off to tend the cattle and check for any fences that needed to be mended, Maggie knew that her partner certainly fulfilled that role. He worked hard every day to ensure that they would have as secure a future as possible. He discovered on their wedding day that she came from a higher class than she'd quite admitted, but he'd never taken that as an excuse for him to grow complacent in his endeavors. He toiled in the pastures or the barn, and when he came home, he always found time to spend with her. I think that's a very wise and true statement. Ernestine nodded as she hung the shovel on its peg in the barn. Yes, but it's not an easy thing for couples to achieve. You and Dalton, well, the two of you are always trying to be better for the other one. That's a very special marriage, and I hope you know it. It's rare. Yes, Maggie said with a smile, feeling the lush grass under her feet as they stepped back out of the barn. Summer had fully blossomed here in Grand Ridge, leaving the hillsides thick and verdant and the air smelling of pine and wildflowers. I definitely do. Now that you're all settled in with each other, Ernestine said as they headed over to the well, there's just one other thing that I need to figure out. What's that? Maggie reached the well first and grabbed the pump. At first, she'd had to put all of her might into bringing the water up to flow out of the spigot. It had made her arms sore and exhausted, and she'd feared that she might never truly be cut out for living here. Now, though it still took strength, she found that she'd grown much more used to it. She easily filled the bucket that her mother-in-law placed at the foot of the pipe. Ernestine switched the full bucket out for a second one. I'll have to figure out where I'm going to live. Maggie stopped pumping. What do you mean? The old woman waved a hand so that she'd keep going. I can't imagine that the two of you still want me to remain here. I'll have to find myself a little cottage in town. You most certainly will not. Maggie took her hands off the pump entirely and instead squared them on her hips. You're staying right here with us. That's very sweet of you, but I don't want to get in the way. But you've taught me so much, and there's still so much more that I want to learn, Maggie insisted. She took her frustration out on the pump and filled the other bucket. It's not even just that. I like your company. Ernestine gave her a curious look. Are you sure about all of that? You're not just being kind? Not at all. Maggie picked up a bucket and the two of them brought the water over to the freshly planted garden. Haven't you heard that I'm not a very nice woman at all? That's why I'm wild and untamable and I say whatever is on my mind. Cackling, Ernestine nearly spilled her water. I have heard some rumors. So the matter is settled then, Maggie concluded. What matter is this? Dalton asked, riding up behind them and bringing his horse to a halt. Dalton? Her heart still lifted every time she saw him, even if he'd only been gone for a short time. He was so strong and handsome, and she loved the way he looked at her. You're back early. I need some lumber. I thought I was lucky in that I hadn't seen any breaks in the fence lately. One of the cows decided I should be put in my place. Dalton swung down from the saddle. Now then, what's this matter that's been settled? That your mother should continue living here with us. Maggie lifted her chin slightly. She didn't think Dalton would have a word to say otherwise, especially since he hadn't yet brought up the subject, but she was prepared if he did. I don't see any reason why she should have to go find herself a cottage somewhere, as she was just suggesting a minute ago. I just don't want to impose on your life, Ernestine said to her son. Dalton stared at her for a moment before he broke out in a loud laugh. Ma, you're always telling me I have to make my wife happy, so if she wants you to stay, then that's final. Well, Ernestine concluded now that the issue was decided once again. I suppose it'll be much easier to see my future grandchildren if I'm staying right here. Precisely, Maggie agreed. Dalton turned, squinting at a column of dust that was rising along the lane. Looks like we've got a party. Someone is coming in and fast. Maggie recognized the grass green of the rider's dress. That's Sarah. I do hope everything is all right, Ernestine said, lacing her fingers together. Nobody rides like that just for fun. Sarah just might, Dalton mused. When she pulled up in the barnyard, she barely let her mount come to a complete stop before she was out of the saddle and on the ground. Her bonnet had flown off her head and flapped behind her, remaining with her only because of the ties. With flushed cheeks, she rushed toward Maggie. "I just came from town," she panted. "I asked after your mail at the post office to save you a trip. There's something here from Boston." The mere mention of her hometown made her stomach do strange things. Maggie reached slowly out for the envelope. She'd tried not to think too much about Boston, not after Edward's appearance and then sudden disappearance again. Sheriff Turner had gone after him when he'd run out of the church, but the fast horse Edward had picked up somewhere along the way to Grand Ridge had fled too quickly. Strength. As she took the mail in her hand, she recognized her mother's calligraphy. With shaking fingers, she broke the seal and removed several pieces of paper folded together. Maggie knew everyone was watching her as she scanned the words, waiting. Wanting to ensure that she was correct, she read them over again. "The police have caught Edward," she finally said. "He returned to Boston, imagining that none of what happened out here would go back east with him." Sheriff Turner had informed the authorities out there about all that he'd witnessed that day. He included details of the confession I'd made with him a few days after we'd married. It wasn't difficult for the police to find some other witnesses to corroborate just what the Rowland family had been up to, and now both Edward and his father are behind bars. "Look, she's even sent a clipping from the newspaper." "Will you look at that?" Ernestine marveled. "It looks like he got just what he deserved. I like to see that." "Are you all right?" Sarah asked, watching Maggie carefully. "You know, I really am," Maggie admitted. In fact, her entire body suddenly felt lighter. She had still been weighed down by her past. She and Dalton had cleared the air between them, and there was no good reason to think Edward might come back and try to harass her once again. Still, knowing with all certainty that proper justice had been served made all the difference. She was truly free of her past now, and she could look forward to everything else life had to bring her. "I don't think I've ever been better." "It's very good news," Dalton agreed, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple. "We should thank Sheriff Turner for what he's done to help." Ernestine held her finger up in the air. "I'll get started on a basket of cookies right now. Then the two of you can take them over there." Maggie laughed. Ernestine was a true delight, and she couldn't imagine what life would be like if she didn't live right here on the ranch with them. "You'll stay for supper, Sarah?" "I'd love to," Sarah smiled. "We can work out where your parents will stay when they visit." Maggie nodded. In the days of her wedding, she dared to hope that Dalton would be true to his word, that he believed her. He'd stuck close by her until the sheriff had confirmed that Edward had indeed been chased out of the territory. Now her heart swelled with joy, with love. Something's fallen out. Dalton bent down and retrieved a crisp sheet of paper that had slipped from the others in Maggie's hand. She unfolded it, and excitement filled her. "It's from Camilla, my maid. Oh, I've missed her." "Go write your reply," Sarah urged. "I can take it with me back to town with me." "I don't know that I'll get it done in time," Maggie replied, folding it back up and slipping it into the envelope with the letter from her mother. "I've got a lot to do yet today. I'm sure Ma can spare you for a few minutes." Dalton gently laid his hand on her lower back and gazed at her warmly. "You work hard, and you've held back on writing home for a long time. Go on." "All right." Maggie stopped in the house just long enough to fetch her writing materials and a small lap desk. She brought everything outside so that she could enjoy the breeze and the way it made the grass on the hillsides ripple. She enjoyed her new horizon. "Dearest Camilla," her heart poured out through her pen. Maggie apologized for having to leave so suddenly and without explanation, though she knew that everyone would come to understand in time. She told of her adventures here, of how strange and wonderful it was to live in an entirely new place. Everyone back home already knew Edward's fate, and so she only touched on his little visit lightly before she got to the heart of the matter. "When I saw Dalton's advertisement in the paper you brought to me, I wrote to him because I thought it would be a way out. If I wasn't there to tell the authorities what Edward had done, then perhaps the whole business would resolve itself. I can see now that I was so very wrong about that. I should have been the same Margaret I'd always been, fearless and full of resolve. However, I thank God every day that I made that wrong decision. I never would have met Dalton, and he is truly the love of my life. I feel like I'm an entirely different person now, but it's because I'm the person I was always meant to be. He's warm, generous, and hardworking. His mother lives with us, and she's an absolute delight. I regret that I had to leave my family, but I'm so content in knowing that I've found another one. Pausing with her pen above the page, Maggie looked around again. This was her home. Now that she was here, it was strange to think that she'd ever belonged anywhere else. She wanted to see this land grow and thrive. She wanted to raise her children here and grow old here. There might come a time when she would make the trek back to Boston to visit, but this was where she would always return to. I do hope that we can continue to write, and I'd love for you to come and see the ranch someday. You've always meant so much to me, Camilla. You were not just part of the staff. You were my friend, and perhaps the only true one that I had. I can't wait to hear from you again. Love, Maggie Sinclair. The end.